The sound of sirens echoed through the busy streets of New York as the fire truck raced against time. Ethan Carter was in command, his gaze serious and focused as he watched the buildings around him, mentally calculating what awaited them at the next corner. Thick smoke was rising from a commercial building in Lower Manhattan, and the frantic calls coming into the dispatch indicated that the fire had already spread to the upper floors. Ethan's hands were steady on the radio as he gave clear instructions to his team, his calm voice contrasting with the growing adrenaline inside his body. The truck came to a screeching halt in front of the burning building. Orange flames violently danced through the windows, spewing black smoke that darkened the sky. Without hesitation, Ethan jumped out of the truck, already fully geared up. He quickly assessed the situation as other firefighters began to organize the perimeter, keeping onlookers at bay and checking the hydrants. "There are people trapped inside," shouted Jake Thompson, one of Ethan's colleagues, as he ran toward him. "The fire started on the 10th floor. They're still evacuating, but there are people on the upper floors who couldn't get out." Ethan nodded, split into two groups. One goes to the 9th floor, the other to the 11th. "I'll head to the 10th. We need to get them out before the stairs become inaccessible." The team moved swiftly. Ethan entered the building with his oxygen mask, feeling the increasing heat as he climbed the emergency stairs. The muffled sound of sirens outside was a constant reminder that time was running out. The fire was raging, and the thick smoke made visibility difficult. He knew every second counted. Reaching the 10th floor, Ethan found a group of people huddled in a corner of the hallway, terrified and covered in soot. The desperation on their faces was evident. "Come with me," he said firmly, gesturing for them to follow. "We're getting out of here, calmly, all together. Stay low, don't inhale the smoke." An elderly woman hesitated, fear paralyzing her legs. Ethan knelt, placed a hand on her shoulder, and encouraged her. "I'll get you out of here. Trust me." She looked at him, her confidence growing slightly, and with Ethan's help, she managed to stand. With the others following close behind, he began guiding them down the emergency stairs. The flames were approaching, consuming everything around them, but Ethan remained focused on ensuring everyone got out safely. In the final flight of stairs, the smoke became unbearable, but finally, they reached the exit. Outside, chaos reigned. Ambulances were already lined up, treating the injured and those affected by the smoke. Ethan helped the last of the people down the steps, and once he confirmed they were being treated, he took off his helmet and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He barely had time to catch his breath when he heard a scream. "There are more people up there." Immediately, his mind went back into emergency mode. The fire was getting stronger, and the building's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The rescue team would need to work even faster if they wanted to save the remaining lives. "We're going up again," Ethan said to Jake, who had barely recovered from the first rescue. They knew going back would be risky, but leaving anyone behind was never an option. The second incursion was even more intense. The fire had already advanced through the corridors, making it impossible to use the stairs they had previously descended. Ethan and Jake climbed through the service elevator, a last resort, as all other exits were compromised. At the top on the 12th floor, they found two more survivors. One of the men was trapped under a fallen metal beam. "Help me, please," he screamed in pain and desperation as the flames approached. Ethan and Jake acted quickly, lifting the beam while the man cried out. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke felt like a thick, black wall. "We got him. Let's get out of here," Ethan shouted, pulling the man toward the exit. Once they were outside again, Ethan handed the survivor over to the medical team. He was covered in soot and exhausted, but the injured were safe, and that was what mattered most. But as he removed his helmet, he spotted someone he never expected to see there. Near the ambulances, a dark-haired woman with a focused expression was tending to one of the injured. She wore the emergency uniform from Bellevue Hospital, and her presence made Ethan's heart stop for a moment. It was Emily Quinn, the same Emily he had loved deeply a decade ago, the same woman he still felt something for, even after all these years. He had thought that time and distance had erased him from her memory, but now, suddenly, she was there, within sight, tending to patients amidst the chaos. For a second, he couldn't move. The past resurfaced in a wave he hadn't expected to feel so strongly. Memories of when they were young, in love, and inseparable came flooding back. But then, just as abruptly, the painful separation and the control of her family invaded his mind. Everything they had was brutally cut short, and he wasn't the same man now. Emily, focused on her patients, didn't seem to have noticed his presence. With each passing second, she moved between the injured, checking vital signs and giving quick instructions to the medical team. She seemed so professional, so different from the free-spirited young woman he had known all those years ago. Ethan slowly approached, still covered in soot, trying to process the fact that fate had brought them back to the same place after so long. He was about to call her, to say something, anything, when their eyes met. Time seemed to stop at that moment. Emily froze. She blinked once, twice, as if trying to understand if what she was seeing was real. Ethan Carter, the man she had loved and lost, was standing there before her, after so many years. A mixture of emotions crossed her face: surprise, shock, maybe even a hint of pain. Everything she thought she had left behind came rushing back all at once. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. They were immersed in a tense silence, as if both were trying to decipher their own feelings and understand what this reunion meant. Ethan felt his heart race in an unusual way, as if he was about to relive something he thought he had buried. "Emily." His voice came out hoarse, almost choked by the dust and emotion. He didn't know what else to say. After all, a decade now separated them. Everything was different. She finally took a deep breath, quickly regaining her composure. "Ethan." Her voice sounded distant, as if she were shielding herself from the memories that began to invade her. A paramedic called for Emily, interrupting the moment. She averted her gaze, returning to her work, but something inside her had changed. Ethan knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same. As she walked away, Ethan stood still, watching her. The weight of the unexpected reunion hit him hard. They had found each other again, and the past was about to collide with the present, bringing to light all the unresolved feelings that had been dormant for so long. Taking a deep breath, Ethan returned to his work, but now his mind was racing. Emily Quinn was back in his life, and he knew that this reunion would not be the end of the story. The sound of sirens and the chaos around him began to fade from Ethan's mind as he watched Emily walk away quickly, immersed in her mission to save lives. The unexpected reunion had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and for a moment, all his focus on the job disappeared, replaced by a wave of memories that dragged him back to a time he thought he had buried. It felt as if it had all happened just yesterday. He and Emily had been inseparable when they were young, living a passionate love that seemed invincible, a love they believed would overcome any obstacle. Ethan remembered the walks through New York's parks, the endless conversations on warm summer nights, when the future seemed so simple. To him, Emily was the center of everything, the reason he felt invincible. When he looked at her, nothing else mattered. They had met at the end of high school, one of those coincidences life throws in your path without warning. Ethan, with his simplicity and natural charm, quickly won Emily's heart, who, despite coming from a wealthy and influential family, had never felt comfortable in the world of luxuries and rigid rules in which she was raised. Ethan was the opposite of everything she knew: free, fearless, and always ready to pursue his dreams, regardless of others' expectations. And perhaps that was what attracted her most to him. Emily, in turn, was the embodiment of everything Ethan had never thought he could have. Intelligent, strong, and determined, she had a clear vision of where she wanted to go in life. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, of helping people, and he admired her deeply for that. Together, they formed an unlikely pair, but one that seemed to complete each other in every way. Ethan always believed that the strength of their love would keep them together, even though the worlds they lived in were so different. But that belief didn't last long. The first sign that things wouldn't be so easy came when Emily's family began to interfere. The Quinns were known for their wealth and influence in New York, a family with traditions and expectations. Her father, a ruthless businessman, had clear plans for Emily's future, and those plans did not include a relationship with a boy from a lower class, especially a firefighter who, in the family's eyes, had no promising future. At first, Emily tried to resist. She knew the love she felt for Ethan was real, and she believed that would be enough to overcome any barrier. But the Quinns were relentless. Family gatherings turned into silent battlefields, with Emily's parents constantly pressuring her to reconsider her choices. They repeatedly reminded her of the responsibilities she had as a member of the Quinn family, of the need to align herself with someone who matched the name and social standing she occupied. The turning point came when Emily was called to a meeting with her parents on a cold autumn afternoon. They sat in the impeccably decorated living room, with her father, Henry Quinn, speaking in a controlled but firm tone. He didn't raise his voice, but the impact of his words hit like a punch. "Emily, it's not about what you want right now. It's about what's best for your future." Emily tried to argue, but her mother, always cold and distant, stepped in. "You are a Quinn. We have expectations. You have responsibilities. This boy, Ethan, he will never be able to offer you what you need. He's not part of our world." Those words cut Emily deeply. She knew they weren't talking about Ethan as a person, but rather about the idea of who he was, or more specifically, who he wasn't. To her parents, Ethan represented a life outside their control, a threat to the path they had laid out for her since childhood. The pressure only increased in the months that followed. With each encounter with Ethan, Emily felt more suffocated by guilt. She loved Ethan, but the constant interference from her family, the insinuations, the disapproving looks, and the suffocating expectations began to wear her down. She wanted to fight for them, but over time, she began to doubt her own strength to resist the tide of pressure surrounding her. And then came the ultimatum. In the final year before leaving for medical school, her parents took her out for a special dinner. During the meal, Emily felt that something was about to happen, and her instincts were right. Henry Quinn, in his calm voice, told her that he had arranged her transfer to a university in Boston, one of the best for medicine. The decision was made. Emily had no choice, and her parents made it clear that if she insisted on staying with Ethan, they would no longer support her. She found herself cornered. Her father's words echoed in her mind like an inevitable sentence. It was a choice between the love she felt and the future she had always dreamed of. Ethan or medicine. The pressure crushed her, and Emily found herself trapped in an endless cycle of anxiety and guilt. The night she told Ethan, they were in the park, the same one where they used to walk together. Her voice trembled as she explained what had happened. "They won't let me stay, Ethan. If I don't go, I'll lose my chance to study medicine. And they won't support me if I stay with you." Ethan tried to argue, insisting that they could find a way, that their love was strong enough. But Emily knew that as much as she wanted to believe that, the weight of reality was greater. She was being pulled away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. They broke up that night. Emily's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, but she knew, in her mind, that it was the only choice. Ethan was devastated. For weeks, he tried to convince himself that she would change her mind, that she would come back to him. But the distance between them grew quickly as Emily went to Boston, and soon, all contact between them ceased completely. Now, years later, seeing her again, Ethan felt as if the old wound was being reopened. The pain of the separation, the sense of helplessness he felt as he watched her leave, all of it came flooding back with an intensity he hadn't expected. He thought he had moved on, that time had healed the wounds, but there, standing amidst the ashes of a burning building, he realized that the past had never truly disappeared. For Emily, the reunion was also a shock. For years, she had focused completely on her career. She had become the doctor she had always dreamed of being, but the price had been high. Her personal life had taken a back seat, and she had grown used to living without Ethan, even though she had never completely forgotten him. She had buried her feelings under layers of work and responsibility, convinced that she had made the right choice. And now, there he was, a living reminder of everything she had left behind. The two of them had been torn apart by forces beyond their control, and even after all this time, the ghost of that lost love still haunted them. The question now looming over both of them was, could the wounds of the past ever be healed? Or had fate simply brought them face to face to remind them that some mistakes can never be corrected? Ethan knew that soon he would have to face her, but for now, he contented himself with watching from a distance, as painful memories of a simpler time and a love he had believed would last forever enveloped him. Dusk was beginning to swallow New York as Ethan returned to the fire station after a long day of rescue operations. His muscles were still tense, and the smell of smoke clung to his skin and clothes, a persistent reminder of his daily routine. The adrenaline that had coursed through his body throughout the day was finally starting to fade, leaving behind a deep exhaustion he knew well. The station had become a second home for Ethan. He had spent most of the last 10 years there, ever since he made the decision to become a firefighter, a choice he had made with pride and determination. Ethan had always believed there was something special about saving lives, something noble that made even the hardest days worth it. Over time, his dedication and skill had made him one of the most respected firefighters in the New York Fire Department, both among his colleagues and superiors. He wasn't just a natural leader, he was someone who inspired confidence on every mission. But at that moment, his mind wasn't entirely focused on his career. The reunion with Emily had shaken the balance he had built over the years. The feeling of reliving the past, of being forced to confront a part of himself he thought he had left behind, was an uncomfortable surprise. Ethan had always known she was in the city, but he had avoided looking into details of her life. He convinced himself it was better to move on, to focus on the present and on his work. But now, all of that seemed fragile. As he changed in the locker room, peeling off his soot-stained uniform, his mind kept returning, involuntarily, to the image of Emily amidst the chaos, working with the same intensity he did. She had changed so much, yet somehow she was still the Emily he had known. He wondered what her life was like now. Was she happy, or just going through the motions, much like he often did? The fire station was relatively quiet at this hour. Some of his colleagues were playing cards in the lounge, while others were doing maintenance on the equipment, a necessary routine after such a busy day. Jake, his longtime friend, was sitting on the couch, rubbing his shoulder after a minor injury during the rescue. He looked at Ethan with a tired but friendly smile. "Tough day, huh?" Jake said, stretching out on the couch. It felt like that building was never going to stop burning. Ethan nodded, still lost in thought. "Yeah, it was rough, but we got everyone out. That's what matters." Jake watched him for a moment, frowning slightly, as if sensing that something else was bothering Ethan. "You okay, man? It's not just exhaustion, is it? You seemed a bit distant since we got back." Ethan knew Jake well enough to realize he could tell when something was weighing on him, and for a moment he hesitated. Telling Jake that he had seen Emily again was something he had been avoiding, as if by keeping it to himself, he could delay dealing with the emotions that came with it. But eventually he sighed. "I saw Emily today." Jake raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Emily? Emily Quinn? Damn. How long has it been?" Ethan shook his head. "About 10 years. I knew she was in the city, but I never expected to see her like that, in the middle of an emergency. She was there, at Bellevue Hospital, treating the injured. Looks like she became the surgeon she always wanted to be." Jake leaned back on the couch, absorbing the news. "Wow, that must have been weird, to say the least." "It was more than weird," Ethan admitted, feeling the weight of his words. "I wasn't ready for it. Seeing her there, so focused, so different, and yet still the same, it was like all that time without her just vanished." Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Do you think it's going to affect you? I mean, are you handling the fact that you saw her again? Or is it going to mess with you more than it should?" Ethan laughed without humor, rubbing his temples. "Jake, it's already messing with me, and I hate admitting that. I spent years trying to move on, burying everything that happened. But now, it feels like nothing's changed, like it's all still there, waiting to come back up." Jake nodded, understanding. "Well, if you need to talk more, I'm here. And if you don't, I get that too." Ethan thanked him with a nod, knowing that, in a way, just saying it aloud had helped. But he also knew that the situation wouldn't be resolved so easily. Emily was back in his life, even if in an unexpected way, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Meanwhile, across the city at Bellevue Hospital, Emily was finishing a long shift. The day had been a whirlwind of chaos and challenges, but that was nothing new for her. As one of the hospital's most respected trauma surgeons, Emily was used to handling emergencies. Her team trusted her completely, and the patients who passed through her care knew they were in the best possible hands. But despite her professional competence, tonight felt different. The reunion with Ethan had shaken her deeply. When she finally got a break, she sat alone in the break room, her head still spinning. It had been so long since she had last seen him, and over the years, she had convinced herself that the past was buried, that Ethan was just a distant memory, something she had left behind to move on with her life and career. But now, everything she thought she had overcome was back, and with force. When she saw Ethan again, covered in soot, but with that same firm look in his eyes that she knew so well, something stirred inside her. She remembered how he used to be her safe harbor, the one place where she could be herself without the weight of family expectations. But along with that came the painful reminder of why they had separated, the relentless pressure from her family, her father's ultimatum, and the feeling that she had no choice but to leave Ethan behind and follow the path laid out for her. Emily had spent years building a barrier around herself. She had become the professional her family always expected her to be, but in exchange, she had lost parts of herself. The responsibilities weighed heavily on her shoulders, and she rarely had time to think about her personal life. The few relationships she had since then never compared to what she and Ethan had shared, and deep down, she always knew that. But now, with him back in her life, even if by accident, she was questioning whether she had made the right choices along the way. As the night deepened, Emily finally stood up from her chair and walked over to the window of the break room. The city shone with its relentless lights, indifferent to what was happening in the minds of its inhabitants. Emily knew that Ethan was nearby, living a life she had walked away from. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't help but wonder what her life would have been like if things had been different. If she had chosen love over her career, if she had stayed with him. But now there was no way to turn back time. She was the surgeon she had always wanted to be, and he was the brave firefighter he had always been. They had taken different paths, but somehow their lives had crossed again, and that left her feeling uneasy. The rest of the night became a blur of hospital activity. More emergencies arrived, and Emily had no choice but to bury her thoughts under layers of intense work. Each surgery, each medical decision, lifted some of the emotional weight off her shoulders, at least temporarily. But as soon as her shift ended, the memories came flooding back. When she finally got home late that night, Emily collapsed on her couch, exhausted. That unexpected reunion with Ethan was affecting her more than she wanted to admit. She knew it was only a matter of time before they saw each other again, whether by chance or some other way. And when that happened, she wasn't sure how she would handle the whirlwind of emotions that had been dormant for so long inside her. But one thing was certain: the past couldn't be ignored forever. They would have to face what had happened. And this time, maybe the choices they made wouldn't be as simple as before. The sound of the subway tracks reverberated through the tunnels beneath New York, mixing with the hurried voices filling the station in the early morning. For most New Yorkers, the day was just beginning, but for Ethan and his fire department team, the day had started long before, with a series of calls already answered. However, nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold. Ethan was in the middle of a casual conversation with Jake when the central alarm went off. The radio in the truck crackled urgently, and the message was clear. An explosion had occurred on one of the city's busiest subway lines, with reports of multiple victims trapped in the train cars. It was one of those situations that demanded immediate and precise action. "We're on our way," Ethan responded without hesitation, his words firm and professional, though his heart was already racing at the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, the fire truck was speeding through the streets of New York, cutting through traffic with sirens blaring at full volume. Ethan, behind the wheel, kept his eyes focused ahead, but his mind was already forming a plan. He knew that subway accidents were complicated, not only because of the underground structure, but also due to the number of people involved. Chaos usually took over quickly. Arriving at the station entrance, the scene was pure pandemonium. Bloodied and dust-covered people were rushing out of the station in a panic, many in shock. Police officers were trying to control the crowd while emergency teams began to organize. The air was thick with a mix of dust and smoke, making visibility poor and movements difficult. Ethan jumped out of the truck and quickly gathered his team. "Jake, take the east side of the platform with Group A. I'll head down with Group B to the west side and check the cars. We need to move fast but cautiously. The structure could be compromised. Any sign of collapse, retreat immediately." Jake nodded and set off with his group while Ethan adjusted his helmet, ready to descend into the depths of the station. As soon as his feet touched the steps of the stalled escalator, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline pumping through his veins. Chaos surrounded him, but his mind was clear. Each step brought him closer to the epicenter of the disaster, and the heat and smoke grew thicker as he descended. Reaching the platform, the scene was even worse. One of the train cars had tipped over, partially destroyed, with debris scattered everywhere. The muffled sound of moans and cries for help echoed in the cramped space, while emergency alarms flashed red, casting an unsettling glow over the scene. Ethan was used to situations like this, but the weight of responsibility never failed to hit him. "Let's start evacuating," Ethan shouted to his team as they rushed toward the overturned train car. He crouched down to look through a broken window and saw a group of passengers trapped inside, some unconscious, others struggling to move but unable to. With a heavy heart and focused mind, he began coordinating the rescue. The sounds of tools smashing through glass and prying open doors mixed with the cries for help, but Ethan stayed focused on every movement, every decision. He knew that every second counted. Across town at Bellevue Hospital, Emily was about to finish her shift when the emergency alert came in, a subway explosion with multiple victims. The hospital was preparing to receive the injured. There would be no rest, and she knew they needed to act fast. The hallways filled with doctors and nurses preparing equipment and surgery rooms. As one of the most experienced trauma surgeons, Emily took charge of the emergency room, organizing teams to handle the influx of patients that would arrive any moment. As the first injured began to arrive, the hospital's chaos mirrored what was happening deep in the subway station. Emily was used to staying calm under pressure, but as she prepared for her next surgery, one name echoed in her mind: Ethan. She knew he would be involved, and though she tried to push the thought aside, worry crept in. This wasn't the time for distractions, but the fear that something could happen to him unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. Back at the subway station, the rescue was in full swing. Ethan and his team had managed to pull several passengers from the cars, but there was still a lot of work to be done. Sweat was running down his face, mixing with the dirt as he helped guide survivors to the exit, ensuring that no one was left behind. Then, he heard a loud crack above him. The tunnel structure gave a concerning creak, and part of the ceiling began to collapse. "Everyone, get back," Ethan shouted, pushing two passengers near him away from the falling debris. Dust and chunks of concrete filled the space, and for a moment, visibility was reduced to almost nothing. Ethan coughed, trying to clear the dust from his lungs, while quickly checking if everyone was safe. As the dust began to settle, he saw that his team was unharmed, but part of the tunnel was now blocked. "We need to find another way out," Jake said, who had joined him by this point. "This route is compromised." Ethan nodded. "Let's evacuate the remaining passengers and find a new way out. We can't risk getting trapped here." Cautiously, they resumed their work, removing the last passengers from the car. But as time passed, the tension in the air grew. They knew they were running out of time. The ceiling was on the verge of completely collapsing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last victim was pulled to safety, and Ethan and his team began their retreat. They climbed the emergency stairs as quickly as possible, each step bringing them closer to the safety of the surface. When they finally emerged at the top, the sunlight seemed almost surreal in contrast to what they had just left behind. Ambulances were lined up, and doctors and nurses rushed around, tending to the injured. Ethan took a moment to observe the scene, feeling relieved that they had managed to get everyone out alive. That's when he saw her again. Emily was on the front lines, treating one of the rescued passengers. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the intensity with which she worked, the quick instructions she gave to the medical team around her. She was in control as always, but there was something in the way she looked at the patient that hit him differently. He knew she felt the same weight of responsibility that he did. Emily hadn't noticed Ethan's presence immediately, but when she finally looked up, their eyes met. The brief moment of recognition between them was filled with a silent tension. For a second, all the chaos around them seemed to disappear. There were no injured, no sirens, just the two of them, caught in a gaze that said more than any words could. But as quickly as the moment came, it was gone. Emily looked away, returning her attention to the patient in front of her, and Ethan did the same, knowing that duty came first. After that brief encounter, both returned to their respective routines, focusing on the work at hand. However, as the day went on and the number of victims dwindled, the emotional weight of the accident began to settle in. Despite the successful rescues, the impact of the day would stay with them, not only because of the lives they had saved, but also because of the forced reunion and the unresolved tension that lingered between them. When the last victim was finally transferred to the hospital, Ethan leaned against the fire truck, exhausted but relieved that it was all over. He knew that, inevitably, he would have to face what he was feeling for Emily. And perhaps, at some point, talking about the past would be the only way to move forward. Emily, back at the hospital, felt something similar. She also knew that this wouldn't be their last encounter, and that no matter how hard they tried to avoid it, the past would continue to resurface in their lives. As night fell over New York, both of them, in different parts of the city, knew that sooner or later, they would have to confront what they had been avoiding for so long. Emily's apartment, located in one of Manhattan's busiest neighborhoods, was a peaceful retreat amidst the constant chaos of New York. Elegantly and simply decorated, the space reflected her focused and controlled personality. Yet that afternoon, as she stood by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, she felt anything but tranquil. Since the subway accident and her unexpected reunion with Ethan, her mind kept returning to him, leaving her restless. So many years had passed, but he still had the power to affect her in ways no one else could. The sound of the intercom interrupted her thoughts. Emily sighed before answering, expecting a delivery or a colleague from work. But to her surprise, the familiar voice of her brother, Michael, echoed through the speaker. "Emily, it's me. I need to talk to you. Are you home?" She hesitated. Michael wasn't the type to make surprise visits, especially on a regular workday. What could he be doing there, unannounced? A feeling of unease settled in her stomach, but she answered as calmly as she could. "I'm home. Come on up." Minutes later, the door opened, and Michael walked into the apartment. Tall, elegant, and with a serious expression, he carried the imposing presence that Emily always associated with their childhood. From a young age, Michael had taken on the role of protector, but over time, that role had morphed into something more controlling, influenced by the family's pressure. He had become an extension of their parents' expectations, always ready to enforce the family's vision for Emily, especially when it came to her personal choices. "Michael, what are you doing here?" she asked as he entered, removing his coat and casually hanging it on a nearby chair. "We need to talk," he said, ignoring her question. "I heard that you and Ethan crossed paths again." Emily frowned, surprised at how quickly the news had reached him. "How did you hear about that?" Michael stepped closer, crossing his arms as he looked at her, with a mixture of concern and authority. "That doesn't matter. What matters is what you're planning to do about it." She sighed deeply, feeling the familiar weight of the Quinn family's expectations descending upon her. It was hard enough dealing with her own confused emotions about Ethan, and now her brother was there, ready to remind her of everything she had tried to overcome. "Michael, what do you think is going to happen?" "Ethan and I worked on the same rescue. It was a coincidence, nothing more than that." She kept her tone firm, but she knew he wouldn't accept such a simple explanation. Michael shook his head in disbelief. "You think you can just run into the guy who ruined your future and act like it's nothing?" "Emily, you have to be realistic. We've been through this before. I'm not going to let you make the same mistake again." Irritation started to rise within her. "He didn't ruin my future, Michael. That's what you all wanted me to believe. You, Dad, and Mom always made me feel like everything that went wrong was his fault. But the truth is, you forced me to choose." Michael's gaze remained steady, ignoring the criticism. "We forced you because we knew what was best for you. And we were right. Look at where you are now. You're one of the top surgeons in New York, exactly where you should be. If you had stayed with Ethan, where do you think you'd be? You know he could never give you the life you deserve." Emily felt a pang in her chest as she heard her brother's words. It was the same conversation they'd had for years, the same rhetoric that Ethan wasn't enough, that he didn't belong in her world. But now, after so much time, it felt even more unfair. Ethan was one of the most respected firefighters in the city, someone who risked his life every day to save others. He was strong, brave, and above all, genuine. She knew that, she always had. Michael, This conversation isn't going anywhere, she said, trying to keep her calm. What happened in the past? I made that decision because I felt pressured. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to me. And as for now, Ethan and I are professionals. There's nothing more to it. Michael laughed bitterly, crossing his arms. Don't be naive, Emily. Do you really think you can just go back to working alongside him without all of your history coming back? You both have a past, and you know very well that if you're not careful, you'll end up making the same mistakes. And frankly, I can't let that happen. Emily's frustration was growing. She had always known that her family disapproved of Ethan, but after all this time, she had hoped that Michael, at least, would have a more mature perspective on things. Yet here he was, representing all the expectations and judgments of their parents, as he always had. Michael, you might not like him, but Ethan isn't the problem here. You all made me believe he was, but the truth is I walked away because I felt like I had no choice. And that still weighs on me, even now. Michael's face hardened, and that's exactly what worries me. Can't you see that you're fooling yourself? You have an incredible career, a life most people would envy, but then he shows up, and suddenly you start questioning everything. Emily shook her head, unable to believe her brother's obstinance. I'm not questioning my career. I love what I do, Michael. But that doesn't mean I have to erase the past. Ethan didn't ruin anything, and you can't just walk in here and tell me how to live my life. Her voice rose involuntarily, reflecting the years of pent-up emotional exhaustion. Michael realized how much control he was losing over the conversation and tried to soften his approach. He sighed, running a hand through his hair with a concerned expression. Emily, I'm just trying to protect you. You know Mom and Dad would be devastated if they knew you were getting close to him again. They want what's best for you. She looked at him incredulously. What they want is control. It's always been about control. It's never been about what I wanted or what would make me happy. Michael stepped forward, trying to maintain his calm posture, but his frustration was evident in his voice. You think happiness is enough? What about the rest? The security, the stability? They know Ethan can't give you that. And frankly, I agree. Emily remained silent for a moment, feeling the weight of her brother's words, but also realizing how hollow they sounded to her now. For years, she had bought into this narrative that her personal happiness had to be sacrificed for the sake of a successful career and a stable life. But after reconnecting with Ethan, everything she thought she knew began to unravel. Michael, I'm an adult. I know what I'm doing. I don't need you or our parents to tell me how to live my life. Yes, I'm a Quinn, but that doesn't mean I have to give up who I am or what I feel. Emily's declaration seemed to shock Michael, if only for a brief moment. He was used to Emily following the rules, doing what was expected of her, and hearing his sister speak so firmly about her own independence was something new to him. So that's it? He finally said, You're just going to ignore everything we've built and risk everything for him again? Do you really think he's changed, that he can give you the life you deserve? Emily looked at her brother, realizing that this conversation would never have a satisfactory conclusion. He wouldn't understand, because he never wanted to understand. To Michael, and to their parents, everything always boiled down to what was practical, safe, and planned. But life, as Emily knew all too well, didn't follow predetermined scripts. Michael, I don't know what's going to happen, she said, speaking with honesty, but I'll figure it out on my own. No more letting you or anyone else decide for me. There was a long silence after those words. Michael seemed to want to argue, but he finally realized it would be pointless. He grabbed his coat, looking at Emily with a mix of frustration and resignation. I just hope you know what you're doing, he said before turning and walking out the door. Emily stood there, alone in the living room, the sound of the door closing echoing through the apartment. For a moment, she wasn't sure how to feel. The conversation with Michael had left her shaken, but also relieved. For the first time in years, she felt she had said what she truly thought, without fear of contradicting her family. As she looked out the window, with the vibrant city in the background, Emily knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But this time, she was determined to follow her own path, regardless of the consequences. Night had fallen over New York, but Ethan's mind wasn't following the stillness that was beginning to settle over the streets. The city that never sleeps seemed ironically calm outside his apartment window, in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He was sitting in his favorite chair, still dressed in casual clothes after a long day of work. But his gaze was fixed on an undefined point ahead. The unexpected reunion with Emily had opened a well of emotions he thought he had buried, but now they consumed him. For years, he had moved forward the best way he knew how, channeling all his energy into his work, his way of pushing aside the doubts and guilt that always haunted him. Becoming one of the best firefighters in the city was how he filled the void left by that breakup that had shattered him. At the time, he accepted the fate imposed by Emily's family, convinced they were right. He wasn't good enough for her, not then, and perhaps never would be. Emily deserved something bigger, something he couldn't offer. The internal pressure of feeling insufficient had always been a ghost in Ethan's life. Since he was young, he knew the world around Emily was different from his. She came from a wealthy and influential family, with clear expectations of what constituted a successful life. He, on the other hand, had chosen to be a firefighter, a noble profession, but one that didn't offer the guarantees of wealth or status. When they started dating, those details didn't seem to matter to them. The love they shared overcame any disparity, or at least, that's what he believed. But over time, reality crept into their lives in a relentless way. Ethan remembered how things started to fall apart. At first, he couldn't understand why Emily seemed more distant, more hesitant. The conversations that once flowed effortlessly began to be punctuated by uncomfortable silences. He knew she was under pressure from her family, but he had no idea how strong that pressure was until the day she said they needed to break up. In that moment, Ethan didn't just lose the woman he loved. He lost confidence in himself. The feeling of not being enough to keep Emily by his side haunted him to this day. Now, so many years later, seeing her again brought it all back to the surface. He had spent years convincing himself that Emily's life was better without him, that she had moved on and achieved everything her family wanted for her. But the look in her eyes during their brief reunion suggested something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. Was there still a place for him in Emily's life? And more importantly, did he want to fight for it? Could he fight, knowing that the same barriers from before still existed? Ethan's inner voice constantly reminded him of his limitations. He hadn't changed that much. He was a good firefighter, maybe one of the best, but the disparity between him and Emily still felt immense. What could he offer her beyond a relationship that wouldn't meet her family's expectations? On the other hand, he knew the love they had shared wasn't something easily replaced, at least not for him. And if Emily felt the same, then what? The weight of so many questions suffocated him. The doorbell rang, momentarily pulling him from his thoughts. He stood up slowly, not sure who it could be at this hour. When he opened the door, he found Jake standing there, looking tired but wearing a friendly expression. "You busy?" Jake asked, holding a takeout bag in his hand. "Thought I'd drop by and share this with you." Ethan stepped aside to let him in, and Jake walked straight to the kitchen table without ceremony. It was the kind of friendship that didn't need formalities. They had been through so many situations together that their mutual trust was unwavering. Jake unwrapped the containers of Chinese food and sat down, pulling out a pair of chopsticks and handing another pair to Ethan. "You don't look great, man. Ever since that subway rescue, you've been different," Jake said as he began to eat. "It's because of Emily, isn't it?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He sat down across from his friend, picking up the chopsticks more out of habit than hunger. He knew there was no point in denying it. Jake knew him well enough to see that something was going on. "It's complicated," Ethan finally said, sighing. "Seeing her again, it made me question a lot of things. I thought I'd moved on, but now that she's back, it's like all the feelings and insecurities are rushing back." Jake nodded, chewing quietly for a moment before speaking again. "I get it, man. But you know that whole not good enough thing is all in your head, right? I saw how much that ate you up back then. But honestly, you were always good enough. You just couldn't see it." Ethan let out a short, bitter laugh. "Hard to believe that, Jake. Her family never thought so. And in the end, that's what mattered. They saw me as someone who could never give her what they thought she deserved. And maybe they were right." Jake looked at him seriously. "It's not about what they think. It's about what you and Emily think. She was under a lot of pressure back then too. If things were different, do you think she would have left you? This wasn't just about being good enough, Ethan. It was more complicated than that. And you can't carry that guilt forever." Ethan knew Jake was right, but it was hard to let go of old wounds. He had built his life around the belief that Emily was out of reach for someone like him, and that shaped how he saw himself. Now, being confronted with the possibility that none of that might be true left him feeling lost. While Ethan battled his own demons, Emily was also grappling with her internal conflict. After the difficult conversation with Michael, she was alone in her apartment, replaying everything that had happened over the past few days. She was used to handling high-pressure situations, but the reunion with Ethan and her family's relentless expectations were pushing her to the edge in a different way. Lying in bed, Emily stared at the ceiling as Michael's words echoed in her mind. He had always known how to prioritize the family, how to convince her that her decisions needed to align with what their parents wanted. For years, she let that dictate her choices, including her decision to leave Ethan. But now, after seeing him again, the cracks in that narrative were beginning to show. Emily was torn. As a doctor, her life was dedicated to duty, to the responsibilities she had chosen to embrace. She loved her work, the impact she made on people's lives. But there were moments when the loneliness of that choice hit her hard. She had given so much of herself to her career that there was little room for anything else. And deep down, she always wondered if she had made the right decision by leaving Ethan behind. Seeing him again had made her realize how much she still felt for him, and how hard she had tried to ignore those feelings over the years. But as much as she wanted to be honest with herself, Emily knew the issue went beyond her feelings for Ethan. There was an unspoken loyalty to her family, the responsibility to meet the expectations that had always loomed over her. And now, while her heart pulled her in one direction, the weight of duty pulled her in another. How could she reconcile these two parts of herself? Was there a way to be true to what she felt without betraying everything she had built? The tension between duty and love, between the present and the past, pressed in on Emily from all sides. And as she lay there, deep in thought, she knew that eventually she would have to make a decision. What she didn't know was whether she had the strength to choose what would truly make her happy. The morning was cold and quiet as Ethan drove toward the fire station. The sunlight struggled to break through the dense clouds covering the New York sky, and he relished the brief moment of calm before another workday began. However, the peace the city tried to offer was deceptive, and Ethan knew things could change at any moment. He had learned to live with this constant uncertainty, always prepared for the next emergency. As soon as he arrived at the station, the radio was already filled with codes and updates on emergency situations. Ethan joined his team in the locker room, exchanging a few words with Jake as they prepared for another day of missions. They had no idea that, within hours, they would be thrown into one of the most dangerous rescues of their careers. Around noon, the alarm sounded. The central radio came alive with a voice laden with urgency. Explosion reported at an office building in downtown Manhattan. Upper floors compromised, multiple victims trapped on the higher levels. All available units, respond immediately. The words echoed in Ethan's mind as he and his team rushed toward the truck. There was a painful familiarity to situations like this, but at the same time, each new mission carried a terrifying uncertainty. The team moved quickly and precisely, climbing into the truck as the sirens began to wail through the streets. During the ride, the tension increased with each block. The affected building was a corporate skyscraper with dozens of floors. The magnitude of the explosion was still unknown, but the initial reports indicated a partial collapse of the upper structures. That meant time was against them. When they arrived at the scene, the chaos was overwhelming. Thick smoke billowed from the upper floors of the building, and shards of glass and metal littered the streets. Dust-covered and bloodied people were running in all directions, while cries of panic blended with the constant noise of ambulance and police sirens. Ethan jumped out of the truck and immediately began organizing his team. The priority was to reach the upper floors where most of the victims were trapped. Jake, take Group A to the east stairwell. I'll take Group B to the west. We need to get these people out before the structure collapses entirely. The looks between them were serious, filled with the understanding that any mistake could be fatal. Ethan didn't hesitate as he ran toward the building's entrance, the heat and smoke intensifying with each step. He led his group up the emergency stairwell, passing terrified people still trying to escape. As they climbed higher, the situation grew more dangerous. The lower floors were relatively intact, but when they reached the 30th floor, the scene changed drastically. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, and visibility was severely impaired by the thick smoke. The air was heavy, and the fire alarms blared incessantly. "We're splitting up," Ethan ordered, his voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "I'll check the offices along this corridor, and you take the back rooms. Watch the structure, any sign of collapse. Get out immediately." He entered one of the partially destroyed offices, where he found a group of survivors huddled under desks. There were 4 people, all covered in dust and blood, with expressions of terror etched on their faces. "Stay calm, we're getting you out of here," Ethan said firmly, guiding them one by one into the hallway. But just as he was about to lead them to the emergency stairwell, a loud crack echoed through the building. The floor beneath his feet trembled, and within seconds, part of the corridor wall collapsed, blocking their only exit. Ethan and the group were trapped. Dust filled the air, making it almost impossible to see, and the survivors' panicked screams reverberated through the confined space. Ethan quickly assessed the situation. The exit was completely blocked by debris, and the other firefighters couldn't reach them. The only form of communication with his team was compromised, and the smoke was beginning to thicken dangerously. He needed to find another way out, and fast. Meanwhile, across the city at Bellevue Hospital, Emily was in the middle of a grueling shift. The emergency room was busy as usual, but there was an unease in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. It was during a brief lull between patients that the emergency alarm rang out. The hospital was preparing to receive victims from an explosion in Manhattan. The number of expected casualties was high, and the medical team sprang into action, quickly reorganizing. Emily was used to handling crises, but as information about the explosion trickled in, her heart began to race unusually fast. She knew that in an emergency of this magnitude, rescue teams would be sent, and meaning Ethan was likely at the scene. The possibility that he was among the first to face the chaos made her pause, with a growing concern settling in her mind. The first ambulances began arriving, and Emily focused her attention on the wounded, moving swiftly between them with skill and precision. But every time a new patient was brought in, she couldn't help but search for any sign of Ethan, pushing away the fear that he could be one of the victims. As the hours passed, more and more casualties arrived, some in critical condition. Emily was completely immersed in the work, performing surgeries and coordinating care. Yet, between each procedure, her mind drifted back to Ethan, and the lack of concrete information about his situation only heightened her anxiety. Then, in the midst of the chaos, she overheard something that made her freeze. One of the paramedics, rushing to the triage area, mentioned that there were firefighters missing at the scene of the explosion. The news hit Emily like a punch to the gut. Her heart pounded, and adrenaline surged through her body. Ethan was among the missing. Without thinking twice, Emily dropped the chart she was reviewing and rushed to one of the doctors overseeing the emergency response. "Who are the missing firefighters? Do we have any information about them?" The doctor looked at her with a serious but hesitant expression. "We don't have all the details yet. We know that some teams are trapped on the upper floors, but communication is difficult. The rescue teams are still trying to reach them." Emily tried to stay calm, but her heart was racing. The thought of Ethan being trapped, or worse, somewhere in that devastated building left her reeling. Her job required focus, but the growing worry made every minute feel like an eternity. Back at the burning building, Ethan was still trapped with the group of survivors in the blocked corridor. The smoke was thickening, and he knew time was running out. Using his flashlight, he scanned the area, searching for any alternative exit. At the far end, he spotted a window partially blocked by debris, but it could be their last chance. He made his way to the window, carefully moving the rubble aside to create enough space to pass through. As he worked frantically, the survivors around him coughed and groaned, the air becoming increasingly toxic. He knew they couldn't stay there much longer. Finally, he managed to open a path to the window. Below, an external maintenance platform seemed like the only possible escape route. It was dangerous, but it was their only option. One at a time, Ethan instructed, helping the survivors through the narrow opening and carefully guiding them onto the platform. The cold wind outside was a welcome relief in the suffocating heat of the building. As the last person made it through the window, Ethan prepared to follow, but a sudden crack echoed through the building, and he felt the floor beneath him begin to give way. He had only a second to react before part of the corridor collapsed, throwing him violently against the wall. Pain shot through him as his vision blurred. When he tried to move, he realized his leg was trapped under the debris. While Ethan struggled to free himself, Emily was at the hospital, anxiously awaiting any news, unaware that the man she was so worried about was now fighting to survive, trapped in the middle of the chaos. Emily could barely keep her hands steady as she moved from one emergency room to another. The sound of ambulance sirens, patients' cries, and the constant hum of monitoring machines felt distant, almost muffled, compared to the deafening noise in her mind. The news that Ethan was missing in the burning building consumed her thoughts. Since hearing the paramedic mention that some firefighters hadn't been located, the world around her seemed to freeze. She had tried, desperately, to stay focused. There were surgeries to perform, critical patients whose lives were in her hands. But with every second between each procedure, her heart clenched tighter with anxiety she couldn't control. All the memories of Ethan, all the emotions she had spent years trying to bury, returned with crushing force. The possibility that he might be injured or worse left her paralyzed. Emily couldn't forget the last time she'd seen him, just days ago. The reunion had been unexpected, and while she had tried to convince herself that she could handle it professionally, she now realized how wrong she had been. The idea of losing Ethan, after everything that had happened, was a pain she didn't know how to process. As she stitched up a patient's wound, her mind kept wandering, inevitably drawn back to Ethan. She had always known that he lived a life of risk, but seeing it up close, knowing that he was in that collapsed building, fighting for his life, made everything real in a way she had never experienced before. For years, she had tried to move on, suppressing the feelings she had for him. But now the truth was undeniable. She still loved him, and the possibility that he might be dead twisted her stomach with anguish. The hospital was in full chaos, with new patients arriving every moment. Even so, Emily found a small window of time to check the radio, receiving updates from the rescue teams at the explosion site. She knew she shouldn't let her emotions interfere with her work, but she couldn't help it. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the radio, hoping for some news. Rescue teams have located part of the missing firefighters, the voice on the radio reported, and Emily's heart stopped for a moment. There are still men trapped on the upper floors, but operations are ongoing. Her chest tightened even more. Was Ethan among those still missing? Was he trapped, injured, with no one knowing if he would survive? The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Throughout her career, she had always been the one who knew what to do, who made quick, decisive choices in moments of crisis. But here, in the hospital, at the mercy of slow-moving information, she felt vulnerable, fragile. It was as if all the control she had over her life was slipping through her fingers. "Emily?" A nurse's voice beside her brought her back to reality. "We need you in room 3. It's an emergency." She nodded automatically, trying to push thoughts of Ethan away. She ran to the indicated room, but even as she worked, the worry for him grew inside her like a dark cloud. No matter how hard she tried to maintain her calm exterior, her mind was miles away, in a burning building, where the man she loved was fighting for his life. Time seemed to crawl. Every second that passed without news made Emily's fear more real, more tangible. Finally, after what felt like endless hours, an update came. The hospital radios began to buzz frantically that another team of firefighters had been found, including Ethan Carter. He was alive. Emily heard the news with a mixture of relief and dread. He had been found, but he was gravely injured, trapped under debris. The rescue team was working to free him, and he was being airlifted to the hospital. The words echoed in her mind, and the world around her seemed to slow to a crawl. He was on his way, but his condition was critical. She couldn't wait. She knew she shouldn't, but she needed to see him. Images of Ethan, trapped under rubble, severely injured, wouldn't stop playing in her head, and her anxiety grew with each passing minute. Without a second thought, Emily left her station and ran to the emergency entrance, where the ambulances and helicopters were bringing in the wounded. When the helicopter finally landed, she saw him. Ethan was on a stretcher, surrounded by paramedics. His face was covered in blood and soot, and his eyes were closed. There was a deep gash on his forehead, and his body was covered in hastily applied bandages. He looked fragile, so different from the strong man she knew. Emily held her breath as she approached. Every step felt like an effort, every movement heavy with the weight of her concern. When she finally reached his side, her eyes locked onto Ethan's face, and the fear she had been trying to suppress broke free. "Ethan," she whispered, but he couldn't hear her. He was unconscious. The paramedics rushed him into the hospital, and while Emily was desperate to stay by his side, she knew she had to maintain her composure. She wasn't just someone who cared about Ethan in that moment. She was a doctor, and there were other lives still depending on her. But every fiber of her being wanted to drop everything, run to the surgery room, and ensure he would be okay. As the trauma team took over Ethan's care, Emily stayed close, watching every step. She saw him taken into surgery, observed the initial scans and the discussions between the surgeons. His condition was serious, but not beyond hope. There was a chance, although recovery would be long and uncertain. She clung to that hope as if it were the only thing keeping her standing. In the hours that followed, Emily tried to maintain her professional facade, but inside, she was breaking. The thought of losing Ethan, after all they had been through, was unbearable. She couldn't fully process what it meant, but she knew she had to be strong. As she anxiously waited outside the surgery room, Michael's words echoed in her mind. He had tried to convince her to stay away from Ethan, insisting that he wasn't the right choice for her. But in that moment, none of those words made sense. Ethan was the only person that mattered. All the success she had achieved in her career, all the sacrifices she had made, seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of losing him forever. Emily struggled to control the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She needed to believe that he would come out of that surgery alive, that they would have the chance to talk, to resolve everything left unsaid. The waiting was agonizing, and every minute felt like an eternity. She stood up, paced back and forth, then sat again, trying to calm her breathing, trying to keep the fear at bay. When the surgery room doors finally opened, Emily held her breath. The lead surgeon stepped out, his expression neutral and composed. For a moment, Emily's world stopped. "He's going to be okay," the doctor said, and Emily felt her legs nearly give way from relief. "There's still a long road ahead, but we were able to stabilize him. He'll need time to recover, but his chances are good." Emily nodded in thanks, unable to speak. The wave of relief that washed over her was so intense that she felt tears welling up in her eyes. She turned away, trying to hide her face so no one would see how much this had affected her. But inside, she was completely overwhelmed. She had almost lost him, and it made her realize, more than ever, how much he meant to her. A few minutes later, Emily was allowed to see him. Entering the recovery room, she approached the bed where Ethan lay, still unconscious. The soft sound of the machines monitoring his vital signs was the only thing breaking the silence. Emily sat down beside him, gazing at his bruised face and bandaged wounds. She reached out, gently touching his hand, and in that moment, everything became clear to her. There was no more denying how she felt. She still loved him, and that was something she could never erase or suppress. But the question that now haunted her was, what would they do with this once he woke up? Ethan slowly opened his eyes, feeling the weight of his still recovering body. The white lights and monitors around him reminded him of where he was, the hospital. There was a familiar sensation in the air, mixed with the confusion of what had brought him there. He remembered the explosion, the people he had rescued, but after that everything was a blur. The pain in his muscles and the bandages on his body confirmed he had come out of it with more than just a few scratches. As his eyes adjusted to the brightness, he heard a movement beside the bed. Emily was there, sitting in a nearby chair, her eyes focused on a chart. She hadn't noticed he had woken up, so absorbed in her reading. For Ethan, seeing her there in silence stirred a mix of emotions he wasn't sure how to handle. He was alive, thanks to the rescue team and the doctors who had treated him. But seeing Emily beside him awakened something deeper he couldn't quite explain. "Emily?" His voice came out hoarse, breaking the room's silence. She lifted her head immediately, surprise and relief flooding her face. Her eyes lit up when she saw him awake, though she tried to hide the intensity of her emotions. "You're awake," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips. "How do you feel?" Ethan tried to shift in bed, though every movement caused his body to protest. "I feel like I've been hit by a truck. But other than that, I'm okay." Emily let out a short, almost relieved laugh, but her eyes still held a trace of concern. "You're lucky, Ethan. A few more minutes, and things could have been very different." He picked up on the seriousness in her voice. There was something more behind her words, something Emily was trying to hide. Ethan knew it wasn't just the concern of a doctor. No matter how much she tried to maintain composure, he could see through her. He could feel the weight of emotions they were both trying to suppress. He still remembered how he felt when he saw her at the rescue scene, how that unexpected reunion had stirred everything he had tried to bury. "I know," he said, his voice softer now. "And as much as I don't know if I can thank you enough for being here." Emily looked away, fiddling nervously with the pages of the chart. "I was just doing my job, as always. You were taken care of by the best. Now you just need to focus on getting better." There was a tension in the air, one they both felt but weren't ready to address. There were so many unsaid things between them, and Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy to break down the walls they had built over the years. Yet, he also knew they couldn't keep avoiding what they were feeling for much longer. In the days that followed, as Ethan recovered, Emily visited regularly. She always had a reason, checking his vitals or reviewing some test results, but they both knew those visits went beyond professional duty. Their conversations became more frequent and comfortable, though they still avoided touching on the deeper issues. "So, how's life at Bellevue?" Ethan asked one afternoon as Emily sat in the chair beside his bed. "I imagine you don't have many quiet days there." She smiled, shaking her head. "Quiet days don't exist in this hospital. Every shift is a new surprise, but that's what I like about it. I like knowing I'm making a difference, helping people when they need it most." "That's never changed," Ethan observed, watching her closely. "You've always wanted to help people. That's one of the things I've always admired about you." Emily met his gaze for a brief moment, catching the underlying meaning in his words, but not delving into it. "And you? Do you still enjoy saving the world, one rescue at a time?" Ethan laughed, but there was a sincerity in his laughter. "I'm not sure I'm saving the world, but I do what I can. Sometimes it's what keeps me going. The work, it gives me purpose, even on the hardest days." They shared a long look, not needing to say anything more. There was a mutual understanding between them, a respect for the dedication they both had for their careers. However, that shared understanding didn't erase the fact that, as they grew closer, there was still an emotional distance neither of them had yet crossed. After Ethan was discharged and returned home, their interactions continued, though often by chance. Emergency missions seemed to multiply, and each time something critical happened in the city, their paths inevitably crossed. There was a fire in a residential building where Ethan led the evacuation, while Emily managed the patients at the hospital. On another day, a bus accident required both Ethan's rescue team and Emily's surgical expertise at Bellevue. Each time they saw each other during these crises, it felt as though fate was conspiring to keep their lives intertwined. The tension between them was palpable, though neither was willing to confront it directly. Their conversations always revolved around work, the severity of the emergencies, or the recovery of patients. But beneath the surface, there was the weight of all that remained unsaid. 1 month after Ethan's accident, they were both called to another emergency. A gas explosion had struck an office building, and once again, the scene was chaotic and destructive. Ethan was in charge of his rescue team, and Emily, as usual, was on the front lines at the hospital, attending to the injured. After hours of intense work, the two briefly met at the scene. Ethan, covered in soot and still catching his breath from the effort, approached Emily, who was organizing the triage of the wounded. She looked at him, and for a moment, the exhaustion on both their faces seemed to vanish. There was something comforting about seeing each other, even in the middle of such chaos. "You look exhausted," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder almost unconsciously. "I am," he replied with a tired but genuine smile. "But I'm still standing, which is a good sign." She smiled in return, but something in Ethan's eyes made her hesitate. He looked at her differently, more deeply, as if he was about to say something important but didn't know where to begin. For a second, she almost expected him to break the silence, and say everything he had been holding back. But instead, he looked away and took a deep breath. "Good work today," he said simply, but with an intensity she felt deeply. Emily nodded, swallowing the words she wanted to say. "You too." They stood in silence for a few more seconds, as if waiting for the other to take the initiative and say what they were truly feeling. But, as with all their other encounters, the invisible barrier between them remained. In the weeks that followed, their interactions became more frequent, but also more frustrating. It was clear that there was something between them, something that went beyond friendship and beyond professional responsibilities. However, both Ethan and Emily were trapped in the fear of reliving the past, afraid that if they brought old feelings to the surface, they would be setting themselves up for disappointment again. They both knew that, eventually, they would have to face what they felt, but time never seemed to be enough, and the wounds were still too fresh. With each new encounter, the feelings grew but remained unspoken, like an invisible thread connecting them, but also holding them back. There was closeness, yes, but there was also a distance neither of them knew exactly how to overcome. As they continued working side by side, day after day, both knew they were at a crossroads. And, at some point, one of them would have to be brave enough to take the first step. It was a cold afternoon in New York, and Bellevue Hospital was, as always, buzzing with the constant movement of doctors and patients. Emily walked through the hallways, immersed in her thoughts after another exhausting shift. Over the past few months, her work routine and frequent interactions with Ethan had stirred more emotions within her than she cared to admit. There was an unspoken tension between them, a lingering, unresolved feeling, and though they both avoided addressing it, she knew something was about to change, or so she thought. As she stepped out of the elevator, Emily was startled by a voice she hadn't heard in years. A familiar voice, but one weighted with a past she had left behind. Emily. Just hearing her name was enough to make her heart skip a beat. She turned slowly, and there he was, David Sloan, tall, elegant, with that same confident aura he had always carried. He looked almost exactly as he did years ago, perhaps a little older, but still possessing the same magnetism her family had always admired. David? She could barely hide the surprise in her voice. She hadn't seen him since she left Boston years ago, after her parents' failed attempt to push her into marriage with him. After all, he had been the man her parents deemed perfect for her, renowned, successful, and part of the elite medical society. The ideal figure to maintain the Quinn family's appearances. But for Emily, it had never been about love. There was never the same connection she had with Ethan. "Surprised to see me?" David asked, flashing a casual smile as he stepped closer. His eyes scanned her, as if trying to decipher what she was feeling. "I moved back to New York a few months ago. The hospital made me an offer I couldn't refuse, so here I am." Emily stood speechless for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. "I didn't know you were back," she finally said, her voice remaining neutral. It wasn't a lie. She truly had no idea David had returned to the city. "I knew you were here," he responded, a glint in his eyes as if gauging her reaction. "It was one of the reasons I accepted the position. I thought it'd be nice to reconnect with old friends." A knot formed in Emily's stomach. She knew exactly what he meant by reconnect. Although they had never been officially engaged, both families' expectations for their future together had always been clear. And while she had distanced herself from that life years ago, it seemed that for David and perhaps her family, the past was still very much alive. She tried to keep her composure. "Well, welcome back, then. It's good to see you're doing well." David chuckled lightly, as if amused by the formality of her words. "Still running away from me, Emily? Just like old times?" His voice, though playful, carried a deeper intent. He was here for a reason, and she knew it. Before she could respond, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let's not waste time here. I know we drifted apart and things didn't go the way our families hoped, but now that I'm back, I think we can start over." Emily's mind was racing as she processed what David was implying. Start over? She knew exactly what that meant. She knew he wasn't just talking about reconnecting as colleagues. He still saw her as the woman their families had envisioned her to be, someone who would follow the predictable path laid out for her, by his side. But the truth was, she was no longer that person. "David, I appreciate your honesty, but things have changed," she said, choosing her words carefully. I've changed. I'm not the same person I was years ago." He studied her for a moment, as if trying to discern what exactly had changed. "Of course you've changed, Emily. We all have, but the expectations are still the same. I know your family still hopes you'll make the right decisions. And frankly, so do I. We could be great together. You know that. We're part of the same world." Her throat tightened as she heard those words. The weight of her family's expectations was always there, even after all these years. David was bringing back everything she had fought so hard to leave behind. She had spent so long trying to distance herself from the imposed expectations, trying to find her own way. But now the past was rearing its head in the most unexpected way. "David, this isn't about expectations. It never was," she said firmly. "I've moved on. I've made my own choices, and honestly, I don't understand why you're still holding on to something that never really existed." David's smile slowly faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Never existed? Emily, we had everything lined up to work. Our parents knew it. You know how much your family still wants you to make the right choices. They still think we can make this work." The mention of her family made her shudder. She knew that if David was here, it was likely because her parents were behind it somehow. It was as if they had taken advantage of David's presence in the city to revive the plan they had tried to impose on her years ago. "David, listen," she said, her voice calmer now, but still firm. "I'm not that person anymore. And honestly, I don't care what my family thinks about who I should or shouldn't be with. They can want whatever they like, but that doesn't mean I'm going to follow the path they've chosen for me." David shook his head, clearly frustrated, but maintaining his calm demeanor. "So, that's it? You're going to keep running from the obvious just to prove a point? Or is this about that firefighter, Ethan? You know your family will never accept someone like him." Emily's heart raced at hearing Ethan's name come from David's mouth. She already knew Ethan would inevitably become part of the situation. It was clear that her family, even from afar, still had control over her choices, and that included the relationship she never truly had the chance to pursue with Ethan. "Ethan has nothing to do with this," she lied, knowing she couldn't completely hide the truth from herself. "This is about me. It's about my choices." David watched her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "You really think life with him will be easy? Do you think you can just ignore what your family expects and be with someone who will never live up to what they planned for you? I know your family, Emily. I know what they want, and so do you. They will never accept this." She knew he was right about one thing. Her family would never accept Ethan. But the truth was, she no longer wanted to live according to their expectations. She had already sacrificed too much in the name of what others wanted, and now she found herself at a breaking point. Reuniting with Ethan and the situations they had faced together only reinforced how much she needed to take control of her own life. "David, I'm not going to base my decisions on what others expect from me anymore. If that means my family never accepts my choices, then so be it." She looked him directly in the eyes, determined. "I choose my own path now." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with a bitter understanding. David realized there was nothing left to say. Emily wasn't the girl he once knew, shaped by her family's desires. She had become a strong woman, determined to live by her own will. "I see you've really changed," he said, his tone resigned. "I just hope you know what you're doing." With that, David stepped back, his face visibly frustrated but composed. He knew he hadn't convinced her, and for the first time, perhaps he understood that he couldn't. He gave a slight nod of farewell and walked away, leaving Emily standing alone with her thoughts. As David's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Emily felt a wave of relief mixed with anxiety. His visit had brought back the pressure she had worked so hard to ignore, but at the same time, the conversation had reinforced her conviction. She was no longer willing to sacrifice her happiness for what others wanted for her. That night, as she left the hospital, the cold New York wind brushed against her face, clearing her mind. Ethan was still in the city, as was David, but more importantly, she was now in control of her choices. For the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face the future, whether it was with Ethan, without him, or on any path she chose. The atmosphere at Bellevue Hospital had grown heavier over the past few weeks, as if an invisible tension lingered in the air. Emily noticed it with each passing day. The reason for this was no secret. David had become more present than ever. Since their unexpected reunion, He had begun frequenting the same spaces as her, not only in the hallways but also during emergencies and medical meetings. His constant presence was an uncomfortable reminder of the past, and worse, it seemed he was deliberately inserting himself into emergency operations, almost as if he were staking a claim. David had always been respected in the medical community, and his reputation at the hospital was impeccable. However, it was the way he treated Ethan that deeply unsettled Emily. The rivalry between the two men had grown into something more than just a personal issue. It had become a professional conflict as well. David, with his arrogant demeanor and sense of superiority, looked at Ethan as someone who didn't belong in their world. In every interaction, David made sure to emphasize the difference in their statuses, something that quietly infuriated Ethan. It all intensified during a major hospital emergency. A massive car pileup had left dozens injured, many critically, and both the medical team and the firefighters were working together to stabilize the victims. Ethan and his crew had rescued several people from the wreckage, and he was coordinating with the paramedics on how best to transport the injured to the hospital. Meanwhile, David was in the trauma room, organizing care for the most critical patients. The first clash between the two occurred in the hallway, where Ethan, covered in soot and blood, was handing over reports about the injured to the doctors. David walked past him, making a remark that, to anyone nearby, sounded more like a provocation. "Still doing the heavy lifting, I see, Ethan. But in here, we need quick decisions and precision. Not sure that's something you're used to." His tone was casual, but the insult was clear. Ethan, already exhausted from the operation, paused for a moment, his eyes locking onto David's. He recognized that kind of comment laden with veiled judgment. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated his profession, but coming from David, the remark felt more personal, as if David were making a point to establish a hierarchy between them. "My job is to save lives, just like yours," Ethan responded, his voice firm but controlled. "The difference is, I do it in the chaos, while you get the luxury of operating in a controlled environment." Ethan's reply wasn't just a response. It was a statement of his own importance in what they did. He wasn't beneath anyone there. Every day, he risked his life to pull people out of desperate situations, and he knew that without his work, many wouldn't even make it to the hospital. Still, David's response came with a cold smile. Of course, but once they get here, it's my job to make sure they survive. I'm just saying some situations require more than brute strength." David glanced briefly at Emily, who was standing nearby, listening to the exchange, before turning back to Ethan with a look that mixed arrogance and challenge. Emily felt the tension rise in the air. She knew Ethan well enough to sense that he was holding back his emotions with great effort. The rivalry between the two men was escalating with each new encounter, and even though she tried to stay neutral, she knew that sooner or later, things could spiral out of control. In the days that followed, the rivalry between David and Ethan manifested more frequently. Every time a new emergency arose, it seemed as though the two would cross paths. If one was handling a situation inside the hospital, the other was on the front lines of the rescue. What had once been procedural interactions had turned into thinly veiled disputes. David criticized Ethan's operational decisions, suggesting that he wasn't quick enough to grasp the hospital's dynamics, while Ethan fired back, insinuating that David had no idea what it was like to face real danger. One afternoon, everything came to a head. A fire had broken out in a residential building, leaving dozens of people trapped. Ethan was leading his team to rescue the victims. When the injured started arriving at the hospital, Emily was once again on the front lines, organizing care with David's help. But what should have been a smooth coordination of efforts turned into a battlefield between the two men. Ethan rushed into the emergency room, carrying one of the victims in his arms, a child severely burned. He carefully laid her on a gurney and immediately began giving the doctors the information on her condition. She was exposed to the fire longer than expected. We had trouble reaching her, but we stabilized her enough for transport. She needs immediate attention. David, standing on the other side of the room, remained expressionless. He approached the gurney, quickly examining the child before turning to Ethan with a slight air of disdain. "You should have brought her in sooner. You know how critical time is in these cases. Now we're racing against the clock to prevent permanent damage." David's tone made Ethan's blood boil. He wasn't just questioning the timing of the rescue, He was insinuating that Ethan had failed. That wasn't something Ethan could easily let slide. "We did what we could," Ethan said, his voice hard. "Rescuing kids from a burning building isn't as simple as making a cut with a scalpel, David. We got her out as fast as we could." David turned to him, his face more serious now. "I'm not saying it isn't difficult, Ethan, but sometimes your work complicates ours. If you take too long, we're left dealing with the aftermath here." Emily, standing beside David, watched the exchange and saw the tension building between them, realizing that the situation was on the verge of escalating. She intervened before the argument could go any further. "Let's focus on what matters right now," she said, her tone calm but firm. "This child is alive because of both your efforts. Let's concentrate on that, please." The tension momentarily subsided with Emily's intervention, but the resentment between the two men was far from resolved. Ethan knew David was intentionally provoking him, and though he tried to maintain his professionalism, it was becoming increasingly difficult not to react. David, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy testing Ethan's limits, as if he wanted to prove that he held a superior position, both professionally and personally. In the weeks that followed, these small disputes became almost routine. David showed up at emergencies, ready to assess the victims Ethan brought in, and their interactions continued to be tense. The conflict wasn't just about how to handle the emergencies, it was about something deeper, a silent struggle for respect and position, both in the hospital and in Emily's life. For Emily, each encounter between the two was a reminder of the burden she carried. Both men were connected to different parts of her life, and watching their constant confrontations left her feeling torn. She knew she would have to address the situation at some point, but for now, she tried to maintain peace, focusing on her work and avoiding personal confrontations. However, she also knew that this growing rivalry couldn't continue indefinitely. With each new clash, the line between professional and personal was becoming more blurred, and Emily feared that, at any moment, something could happen that would make everything even more complicated. Emily was sitting in her living room, staring out the window at the city that never stopped, but inside her, everything felt frozen. The lights of New York flickered outside, indifferent to the turbulence consuming her thoughts. In recent days, the pressure on her had become unbearable. Michael was more present than ever, constantly calling and making unexpected visits to ensure she didn't lose focus. Her mother, always careful with her words, also made a point to subtly remind her of the family expectations and the advantages of being with David, a man who, in their eyes, represented security, status, and a proper life for someone with the Quinn name. On the other side of this equation was Ethan. The memories of the moments they had shared in recent months kept resurfacing in her mind, like fragments of something she was trying to understand but could never fully grasp. He wasn't just the man she had loved in the past now. He represented something much bigger. Ethan was an important part of her present, a constant presence that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in a long time. The connection they had rebuilt, slowly but deeply, made her question everything she thought she was sure of. However, as much as her heart was drawn to Ethan, her mind was divided. There was a whole lifetime of expectations, a family that would never let her stray from what they deemed the right path. The reunion with David hadn't been just a coincidence. It was a clear and deliberate attempt by her family to bring her back to the direction they had planned for her. Marrying David represented, in everyone's eyes, the safest and most sensible choice. He was the perfect man to consolidate the image of success her parents cherished so much. It was an easy, practical decision that would ensure she'd never have to worry about her place in the world. But was that what Emily really wanted? She sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. Michael, once again, had made it clear what the family expected. During their last family lunch, he didn't hold back words to convince her that David was the right choice. "You know it's the most sensible decision, Emily," he said, with the familiar firmness in his tone. "David is an excellent doctor, someone the family respects. He offers you stability, something you've always needed. I don't understand why you're hesitating." She had remained silent throughout the conversation, knowing that arguing with Michael never led anywhere. He was the spokesperson for their parents' wishes, the heir to the legacy everyone expected her to follow too. But inside, something was breaking. With every word from Michael, every veiled pressure, Emily saw herself more distant from who she once was and closer to something out of her control. There was an urgency within her, a need to free herself from the chains that had always kept her bound to those expectations. David, of course, had played his part. In the past few days, he had tried in every way to get closer to her. He had invited her to dinners, appeared at medical meetings casually, and even suggested they take a vacation together, as if that was normal between them. Emily knew that, despite his good intentions, there was something calculated behind every gesture from David. It was as if he knew exactly how to please her family, how to play the game they wanted her to play, and, in a way, that made her uncomfortable. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. Unlike David, he never pressured her. Ethan was there, present, but never pushed too hard. He let her be who she was, without trying to mold her or guide her to a life he thought was right. They shared a connection that went beyond words, something both avoided discussing openly, but that grew stronger with each passing day. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was something real about him, something genuine that made her feel seen, loved for who she was and not for who she should be. The internal conflict was consuming her. She knew that, sooner or later, she would have to choose. And this choice wasn't just between two men. It was a choice between what her family had always expected and what her heart truly desired. The problem was, whatever decision she made, she would have to deal with the consequences. If she chose David, she would guarantee a stable, comfortable life, free from conflicts with her family. But inside, she knew she would live with the feeling of betraying herself. On the other hand, if she chose Ethan, she knew she would face resistance, criticism, and possibly even further estrangement from her family. They would never accept her choosing a man like him, a man who didn't have the status or prestige they deemed essential to maintain the Quinn family legacy. The pressure she would face would be immense, and the idea of disappointing her parents was something that still weighed heavily on her shoulders, even though she knew the life they wanted for her wasn't the life she herself desired. And then, there was the fear that, by choosing Ethan, she was betting on something uncertain, something that might not last. She knew their love was strong, but life had already shown that love alone wasn't always enough. What if, by choosing Ethan, she lost everything and was left without her family's support? What if, in the end, Ethan couldn't handle the pressure that would come? These questions hammered in her mind day and night, and, although she tried to avoid them, the pressure was slowly eating away at her. That night, after work, Emily went to Ethan's apartment. She hadn't planned it. Her feet had carried her there before her mind had time to argue against it. When she arrived, she hesitated for a moment, staring at the door. She was nervous, unsure of what she wanted to say or do, but she knew she needed some clarity, some answer. Ethan opened the door a few minutes later, surprised but happy to see her there. "Emily?" he asked, surprised. "Is everything okay?" She gave a small smile, but there was melancholy in her eyes. "Can I come in?" Ethan nodded, making space for her to enter. The apartment was quiet, cozy, with a soft light illuminating the room. It was a welcome contrast to the turbulence Emily felt inside. She sat on the couch, and Ethan sat next to her, waiting for her to say something. There was a concern in his gaze, as if he knew something serious was about to happen. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words she needed to say. "I'm feeling lost," she began, her voice almost breaking. "My family, David. Everything seems to be pulling me in one direction, but I don't know if that's what I want." Ethan remained silent, watching her closely. He didn't pressure her, letting her speak at her own pace. "My family expects me to marry David. To them, that would be ideal. Stability, prestige, security." She laughed bitterly. "But I don't know if I want that. And, at the same time, I don't know what to do. I'm torn between what they expect and what I feel. And what I feel, for you, it confuses me." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. "Emily, I'll never pressure you to choose anything. I know how important your family is to you, and I know how much those expectations weigh on you. But what matters in the end is what you want, not what they want. And if you don't know what you want, then I understand." She looked at him, surprised by the calm and understanding he offered. Ethan wasn't there to impose anything, to demand anything. He was simply being what he had always been, a man who loved her, but who let her be free to be who she needed to be. And that made her realize, more than ever, what really mattered. The love she felt for Ethan was real, something she knew she wouldn't find in anyone else. But there was still so much to resolve, so many difficult decisions to make. However, in that moment, Emily felt that, perhaps for the first time, she could face those choices, knowing that, no matter what came, she wouldn't be alone. Ethan ran his fingers through his hair, his mind spinning with thoughts he could barely organize. He sat on the edge of his bed, the soft light from the lamp casting a melancholic glow over the room. He stared at the floor as if, somehow, the answers to the questions that had been weighing on him for weeks would appear. What should he do about Emily? The growing closeness between them over the past months had reignited everything he felt, and he knew, with painful clarity, that he was still deeply in love with her. But the situation was complicated, more complicated than it had ever been before. There had been days when he almost confessed his feelings. Every time their eyes met, he felt the urge, as if the words were on the verge of spilling from his lips. But every time it happened, he hesitated. Something held him back, and that something was what had been stopping him from telling the truth for the past weeks. The chaos in Emily's life. The weight of family pressure, David's constant presence, and all the expectations she was trying to juggle made him wonder if it was fair to burden her even more. In recent months, he had watched Emily wrestle with her own emotions, torn between what was expected of her and what she truly wanted. He knew how much her family meant to her, how the decisions she made were influenced by these suffocating expectations. He also knew that David was around, always present, trying to win her back with promises of a perfect, stable life, something her parents enthusiastically approved of. For Ethan, the issue wasn't just about competing with David. It was about something bigger, what he could truly offer Emily compared to what her family expected. There were moments when he felt inadequate. As much as he knew he could offer her true love, he couldn't provide the social stability that David represented. Ethan was a firefighter, a man who risked his life every day, but whose work was seen by many, including Emily's family, as something inferior. He didn't have the connections, the prestige, or the financial comfort that came with David's life. What he did have was his sincerity and the certainty that he loved Emily more than anything. But would that be enough? Ethan sighed, standing up from the bed and walking to the window. He gazed out at the city stretching before him, the lights of New York flickering on the horizon like artificial stars. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push thoughts of Emily away. He remembered all the moments they had shared in recent months, the looks, the smiles, the conversations that seemed to last for hours, and, above all, the connection that seemed unshakable, even after all the time they had spent apart. It was as if, whenever they were together, the world around them disappeared. But then he thought about what came next. He knew Emily was on the verge of making a difficult decision, and he knew her family was pushing her harder each day. There were conversations she didn't share with him, but he knew they were happening. There were moments when she seemed distant, as if something heavy was on her mind, and he understood why. The choices she would have to make were not easy, and that was why he hesitated. Ethan was aware that if he confessed his feelings now, it might complicate her life even more. Emily was already facing so much pressure, the expectation to marry David, the constant interference from her family, the internal battle between what her heart wanted and what her rational mind told her. Adding the confession that he loved her, that he wanted to be with her, could be the final straw that overwhelmed her. He didn't want to be yet another problem for her to solve. He didn't want his love to be seen as a decision she had to make amidst the chaos. He wanted it to be something natural, something she chose without hesitation, without the weight of circumstances. But was that even possible, given everything happening in her life? Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel the fear he had been trying to push away. There was a part of him that was beginning to think that maybe the best thing he could do for Emily was to step back. If he let her follow the path her family wanted, maybe she would find peace. Maybe, by choosing David, she would have the stable, secure life her parents had always wanted for her. And though it would destroy him inside, he knew that true love also meant being willing to let someone go if that was what was best for them. But the thought of letting her go hurt him more than anything he had ever experienced. He loved her in a way that went beyond words, beyond anything he had ever felt in his life. And the idea of seeing her with David, living a life he knew wouldn't make her truly happy, consumed him in a way he couldn't ignore. Days later, as he reflected on all this, Ethan found himself on another emergency mission, this time a serious accident involving multiple vehicles. As usual, Emily was at the hospital, organizing the care for the injured being brought into the ER. He arrived with one of the most critical victims, helping stabilize the person on the stretcher, while Emily worked quickly to coordinate the medical team. They exchanged a brief look in the middle of the chaos, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. No matter what was happening around them, there was always something between them, something that didn't need to be said, but that they both felt deeply. Later, when everything had finally calmed down and the emergencies had been addressed, Ethan found Emily alone in a hospital break room. She was visibly exhausted, her eyes closed as she leaned against the wall. He hesitated for a moment at the door, watching her silently, before slowly approaching. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly, but the exhaustion on her face was evident. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Ethan nodded, sitting beside her. There was something in the air between them, a tension he couldn't fully define but knew was there. They sat in silence for a few minutes, simply appreciating each other's company, as if words were unnecessary at that moment. "Emily," Ethan began, feeling the urgency in his chest, but as soon as the words started to come out, he stopped. There was so much he wanted to say, but something held him back. He looked at her, seeing the weight in her eyes, and everything he thought about saying felt out of place. She was already dealing with so much. What could he say now that wouldn't burn her even more? Emily turned to him, sensing what he was trying to do. She had always known there was something unspoken between them, something they had both been avoiding for so long. But in that moment, she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it. The confusion in her mind, the pressures from her family, and David's constant presence made everything feel blurred. She knew she loved Ethan, but the uncertainty of how to balance everything made her hesitate. "You don't need to say anything," she whispered, almost as if she were reading his thoughts. "I know." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest, the words stuck in his throat. Maybe she didn't know, maybe she felt the same, but even so, he couldn't say it. Not right now. The fear of complicating her life even more kept him from moving forward. He nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "I just wanted you to know that I'm here, for whatever you need." Emily smiled softly, briefly touching his hand before looking back at the floor. There was so much between them that didn't need to be said in words, but at the same time, so many things that needed to be faced. And so, once again, Ethan held back his confession. He knew the right moment hadn't come yet, and for now, maybe that was for the best. The New York sky was painted an intense orange as flames rose from the top of one of the city's tallest skyscrapers. The fire, visible from miles away, was rapidly consuming the upper floors of the building, a sight that froze passers-by in the streets below. Fire engine sirens, ambulances, and police cars echoed through the air, creating a chaotic symphony that reverberated across Manhattan's avenues. The entire city seemed to hold its breath as it watched the tragedy unfolding before its eyes. Ethan was in the midst of the confusion, racing against time. The heat was suffocating, even from a considerable distance from the flames, and thick smoke was beginning to obscure visibility. Beside him, Jake, sweaty and already exhausted, adjusted his gear as they both prepared to ascend to the upper floors. The situation was extremely critical. Dozens of people were trapped between the 45th and 50th floors, unable to descend the emergency stairs, which were now engulfed by fire. "We're heading to the 47th floor," Ethan shouted over the constant noise of sirens and the crackling of the fire. "The teams are focusing on the lower floors, but we need to reach the people at the top before it's too late." Jake nodded, though he was well aware of the risks they were about to face. The building was partially collapsing, with structures giving way with every passing minute. However, leaving those people trapped above was not an option. As they climbed the emergency stairs, the heat increased exponentially. Each flight of stairs felt more difficult than the last, but Ethan and Jake kept their pace, their minds focused only on the mission. When they finally reached the 47th floor, the hallway was shrouded in smoke, and the muffled sounds of screams could be heard in the distance. They began calling for the victims, guiding them through the chaos to the safest path. While helping a group of people toward the stairs, a sudden tremor shook the building. A deafening crash followed by the sound of metal and concrete giving way filled the air. The ground beneath Ethan and Jake's feet shook violently, and before they could react, part of the ceiling collapsed, blocking the stairwell they had just climbed. "Damn it," Jake shouted, throwing himself aside as chunks of concrete rained down around him. Ethan tried to pull one of the victims away from the debris, but the chaos and smoke were making evacuation nearly impossible. They were trapped. The only escape route was now completely blocked. "Ethan, we're out of options," Jake shouted, his voice filled with panic. Ethan looked around quickly, his eyes stinging from the smoke. He knew time was running out. The fire was drawing closer, and the temperatures were rising to unbearable levels. Their options were limited, but he couldn't let panic take over. He had to find another way out, or they would all die there. "We need a plan B," Ethan said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Let's try to reach the other emergency stairwell. It might be damaged, but it's our only chance." They began guiding people through the wrecked hallways, dodging debris in areas that were beginning to give way. The situation was desperate, and the heat was suffocating, but Ethan kept his composure, doing everything he could to ensure everyone got out alive. Meanwhile, at Bellevue Hospital, Emily was in the middle of an intense shift when she heard the first reports about the fire in the skyscraper. A chill immediately ran down her spine. She knew Ethan and his team would be involved in the rescue operation, and with the severity of the situation, the danger was extreme. Trying to hide the growing fear inside her, Emily attempted to focus on her work, but her mind was with Ethan the entire time. With every new update about the incident, she felt her heart tighten. At a certain point, she stopped what she was doing, unable to keep pretending she was okay. The thought that something terrible could happen to Ethan was suffocating. Without a second thought, she handed over her responsibilities to a colleague and rushed out of the hospital. She knew she had to go to the site. She needed to be there, even if she couldn't do anything directly. She couldn't stand the thought of waiting, helpless, for news that could change her life forever. When Emily finally arrived at the scene, the sight was devastating. The building was still ablaze, and rescue teams were rushing back and forth, trying to get the situation under control. She got as close as she could to the restricted area, but was stopped by police. "I'm a doctor," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here to help. Where are the injured?" One of the officers looked at her for a moment before nodding, allowing her to approach the ambulances. Emily began helping with first aid for the wounded who were being brought out, but her mind was elsewhere. She could only think of Ethan. Every new victim rescued made her hold her breath, dreading that she would find his face among the severely injured. Suddenly, she overheard someone mention Ethan's name among the paramedics. Her heart stopped. "Ethan Carter and Jake Thompson are trapped on the 47th floor," one of the firefighters said as he relayed information to the command center. Emily's world spun. He was up there, trapped in the chaos. Her first instinct was to run toward the building, but she knew there was nothing she could do. The flames continued to rise, and every passing minute was crucial. Inside the building, the situation for Ethan and Jake had become desperate. They had managed to reach a temporarily safer area, but the fire was closing in fast, consuming everything around them. The heat was unbearable, and the oxygen masks they were wearing were beginning to fail. "We're running out of time," Ethan, Jake said, his voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. Ethan knew he was right. They were cornered, and the only remaining option was to hope for a miracle from the rescue teams on the ground. He grabbed the radio and tried to communicate, but the static and smoke made reception difficult. "Command, this is Carter. We're on the 47th floor, west side. The way is blocked. We need aerial evacuation. Repeat, we need aerial evacuation. Conditions are deteriorating rapidly." For a moment, there was only silence. Jake looked at him, his eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. But then, the command center's voice finally came through on the radio. "Carter, copy. Aerial team en route, but conditions are critical. Hold your position and prepare for extraction." The confirmation brought a wave of relief for Ethan, but he knew there was still a long way to safety. He looked at the people they had rescued, now slumped against the walls of the corridor, some coughing from the smoke. He needed to keep them alive until help arrived. Outside, Emily watched the sky, her heart pounding erratically. The flames were still visible, and time seemed to stand still. The fear of losing Ethan was overwhelming. She knew that if something happened to him, it would feel like losing a part of herself. There was so much that still needed to be said, so many feelings that had been postponed for far too long. When the sound of rescue helicopters finally echoed through the sky, Emily held her breath. It was the only remaining hope. Inside the building, the sound of the rotor blades was the first relief Ethan and Jake had felt in hours. They began organizing the victims, preparing for aerial extraction. But the fire was closing in fast, and time was running out. One by one, the survivors were lifted to safety by the helicopter, but time was cruel, and the flames threatened to engulf the floor they were on. When it was finally Ethan and Jake's turn, the heat was so intense it seemed impossible to continue. But at the last second, they managed to be pulled out, escaping the burning building. Down below, Emily watched as the helicopter pulled away with the last of the rescued, and her heart raced as she realized Ethan was among them. The tears she had held back for so long finally began to flow freely. He was alive. The cool evening breeze of New York contrasted sharply with the suffocating heat still emanating from the burning skyscraper. The helicopter hovered over the city, but the tension inside was palpable. Ethan kept his eyes on Jake, lying next to him on the stretcher, his face etched with pain and suffering. During the rescue, just when they thought they were about to escape, part of the ceiling collapsed, and Jake was hit by debris that crushed his leg. The injury was severe, and Ethan knew that every second was crucial to saving his best friend. The rescue team had done everything they could to stabilize Jake during the flight, but his condition remained critical. The silence in the helicopter was broken only by the whirring of the blades and the beeping of monitors flashing warnings. Ethan held Jake's hand, silently trying to convey strength while staring at his friend's pale, sweaty face. "You're going to be fine, man," Ethan said, forcing an optimistic tone he barely believed. "We're almost there." Jake briefly opened his eyes, his voice weak, but still dripping with his usual sarcasm. "If I find out I'm going to Bellevue, I might try to hold on until you find me a better hospital." Ethan let out a short laugh, but his heart felt heavy. Jake always managed to joke, even in the worst situations. But Ethan knew this time was different. He had never seen his friend like this, and the fear of losing him was overwhelming. The helicopter landed at the hospital, where a medical team was already waiting on the helipad to receive Jake. Emily was among them, ready to spring into action the moment Jake's stretcher was brought out. She had been informed about Jake's condition and knew it was critical. Her medical training took over, but the fact that Ethan had brought him there and that Jake was in such bad shape filled her with a wave of anxiety. As soon as the helicopter touched down and the door opened, Emily saw Ethan first, covered in soot and sweat, his expression filled with anguish and worry. When their eyes met, she felt the weight he was carrying, and her heart raced. But there was no time for hesitation. Jake needed her. Jake was quickly wheeled into the hospital, and Emily ran alongside the stretcher, examining his injuries as she spoke with the other doctors. "Open fracture in the left leg, possible internal bleeding," she said loudly, trying to stay focused. "We'll need to perform surgery immediately." Ethan followed closely behind, watching as the medical team moved with precision around Jake. He knew there was nothing more he could do now but trust the doctors and Emily. But that didn't make the situation any easier. He was used to saving lives, being in control, but now all he could do was wait. Hours seemed to drag by as Ethan waited in the hospital corridor, the distant sound of voices echoing through the halls. His mind was filled with memories of Jake, how they had become friends, the jokes they shared in the most improbable moments, and the missions they had faced side by side. Jake was more than a work partner. He was family, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. Emily emerged from the operating room several hours later, still in her surgical scrubs, her face tired but determined. She found Ethan sitting with his hands clasped, and he immediately stood when he saw her. "How is he?" Ethan asked, his voice low and tense, bracing for the worst. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair as she tried to find the right words. "The surgery was long, but we managed to stabilize him. The injury to his leg was severe, and he'll need further procedures." We're not sure yet if we can save his leg." She paused, meeting Ethan's eyes. "But he's alive, and his chances of recovery are good." Ethan let out a long breath, feeling the relief wash over him, even with the gravity of the situation. Jake was still in danger, but the fact that he was alive was enough for Ethan to breathe a little easier. "Can I see him?" Ethan asked, knowing Jake would be unconscious and in recovery, surrounded by machines and tubes. "He's sedated right now," Emily replied softly. "But you can go in. Just be prepared. He's still very weak." Ethan nodded and followed Emily to the intensive care unit. When they reached Jake's room, the sound of the machines monitoring his vital signs was the first thing to fill the space. Ethan approached the bed, seeing Jake's pale face, his body wrapped in bandages, and his leg immobilized. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle on his shoulders. "He's going to fight," Emily said gently, standing beside Ethan. "Jake is strong, and he has you by his side." Ethan nodded, but he couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him. "If I had been faster, if I had gotten him out of there sooner." "Don't start with that," Emily interrupted, her tone firm but kind. "You did everything you could. If it weren't for you, he wouldn't even be here right now. And he knows that." Ethan remained silent for a moment, struggling with the emotion rising in his throat. The feeling of helplessness was crushing, but Emily's presence beside him brought unexpected comfort. She was there, caring for Jake with all the skill and dedication he knew she possessed. Even with everything going on in their personal lives, her professionalism was undeniable, and that made him admire her even more. "You need a rest too, Ethan," Emily said after a few minutes of silence. "This isn't going to be over quickly, and you need to be ready for when he wakes up." Ethan let out a long sigh, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up with him. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving behind only physical and emotional fatigue. He knew Emily was right, but the thought of leaving Jake, even for a few hours, seemed impossible. "I'll stay a little longer," he said, his eyes fixed on Jake. "Just a little longer." Emily nodded, understanding. She knew Ethan needed this time. She knew how much Jake meant to him, and she also knew that, in moments like these, it was hard to allow oneself to step away. She watched Ethan for a few more moments before quietly leaving the room, giving him space to be with his friend. But as she walked back down the corridor, something inside Emily was changing too. Seeing Ethan there, concerned for Jake, battling his own guilt, brought up reflections she had been trying to avoid. The fragility of life was right in front of them, and the realization that everything could change in the blink of an eye made her think about the decisions she had been postponing. In the hallway, as she walked back to her station, Emily thought about how all of them, in some way, lived on the edge. The work they did, the risks they took, and the way life and death always seemed to hover near their paths. And then, inevitably, her thoughts returned to Ethan, the man who, silently, had always been by her side, even when she didn't know what she wanted. They had faced so much together, and despite all the obstacles, there was an undeniable truth that she could no longer ignore. She loved him. Jake's situation only intensified that certainty. Life was too short, too fragile, and Emily knew she couldn't keep delaying the things that truly mattered. She had spent too much time trapped by others' expectations, afraid of disappointing her family, afraid of making the wrong choice. But after seeing how far Ethan was willing to go for those he loved, she realized that the only wrong decision would be not following what her heart already knew. In the hospital room, Ethan remained by Jake's side in silence. But as he watched his friend lie there, unconscious, one thing also became clear to him. The love he felt for Emily could no longer be suppressed. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine while hiding what he truly felt. Maybe, once Jake was stable, he would finally have the courage to say what he had always known. That, no matter what the future held, he wanted to be by her side. The air inside the hospital was thick with the silence of the early morning. The only sounds breaking the stillness were the soft beeps of monitors, the occasional hum of machines, and the shuffle of nurses' footsteps hurrying through the corridors. The night had been long for everyone, but for Ethan, it felt endless. He was still sitting by Jake's bedside, watching his best friend, who was now stable but still unconscious. There was relief in knowing that Jake had survived the worst, but the fear and anguish of the past few days lingered over him like a shadow. Ethan hadn't left the hospital since he had brought Jake back from the rescue mission. He had spent hours replaying the moment when he almost lost him, the suffocating sense of helplessness that had crushed him. And more than that, he had been lost in deep reflection about the fragility of life. It wasn't just Jake who had been on the brink of death. He, too, had faced situations that could have taken him. In the most critical moments, one thing had become painfully clear to him. He could no longer live with the weight of his feelings for Emily without finally telling her the truth. He couldn't waste any more time. Rising from the chair beside Jake's bed, Ethan looked at his friend one last time before stepping out of the room. His steps were firm, driven by the conviction that grew inside him with every second. The time he had spent by Jake's side, watching how life could change in an instant, had been the final push he needed. He had kept his feelings hidden for too long, hesitated for too long, and now there was no more room for doubt. As he walked through the hospital corridors, Ethan's heart raced. The sense of urgency consumed him, as though the words he carried needed to be spoken at that moment, before anything else could interrupt them. He knew Emily was somewhere in the hospital, likely still checking on patients, maybe finishing her rounds with Jake, and he needed to see her now. When he found her at the end of the corridor, sitting alone in a small break room, Ethan paused for a moment, watching her in silence. She was sitting with her head in her hands, clearly exhausted after hours of intense work. The way she dedicated herself to the people in her care, the passion she poured into her work, had always impressed him. But beyond admiration, there was the love he felt for her, a love that had never faded, even after years of separation and missed chances. With his heart pounding, he stepped closer. "Emily." Ethan's voice broke the gentle silence of the room, and she immediately looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was surprise on her face, but also something else, a softness, as if she had known this moment was coming for a long time. "You should be resting," she said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. "You've been here all night, Ethan." He gave a small smile, but his expression was serious. "I know, but I couldn't rest, not with everything that's happened." He paused, looking at her deeply. "And I couldn't stop thinking about you." Those words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight they both immediately felt. Emily glanced away for a second, as if trying to process what he had just said. But when she looked back at him, her eyes were filled with questions. She knew something was about to happen, and from the intensity in Ethan's gaze, she knew she couldn't avoid it. "Emily, I need to talk to you. And this time, I'm not going to let anything stop me from saying what I feel." Ethan's words were direct, his voice thick with emotion. He moved a little closer, the tension between them almost tangible. "I love you. I've always loved you, and I've never been able to let that go." The silence that followed was intense. Emily blinked, surprised by the raw and direct confession. She had known Ethan felt something for her, that much had always been clear, but hearing those words now, with such honesty, was like something inside her had finally been freed. "Ethan," Emily began, but he gently interrupted her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Please, just hear me out," he continued, his voice rough, almost pleading. "I've spent so much time thinking that maybe it was better to let you go, that maybe the life your family wants for you is what you need. But after everything that happened with Jake, after seeing how fragile life is, I realize that I can't keep hiding how I feel. I can't keep living without telling you the truth." He took another step closer, his gaze fixed on Emily, who now watched him with a mix of emotion and vulnerability. "I love you, Emily, and I always will. It doesn't matter what your family says. It doesn't matter what David represents or what the world thinks. I need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going to stay silent anymore." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, a storm of emotion she had tried to control for so long. She knew she loved him, she had always known, but the pressure from her family, the constant presence of David, and the fear of making a decision that could unravel her life had made her hesitate for far too long. But now, seeing Ethan here, vulnerable, baring his heart to her in a way he never had before, something inside her broke. Emily began, feeling the words catch in her throat. She struggled to find the right thing to say, but nothing seemed enough. "Ethan, I love you too. I always have. But I've been so scared. Scared that if I chose you, I'd be abandoning everything my family expects of me. Scared that I wouldn't be enough for you. Scared of losing you again." The words finally came out, raw and honest. She looked at him, tears threatening to well in her eyes. "But now, after everything that's happened, I realize that none of that matters anymore. What matters is what I feel for you, and that has never changed." Ethan felt a wave of relief and emotion wash over him all at once. He reached out, gently taking Emily's hand, as if holding something too precious to lose. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm here, and I want to be by your side, no matter what happens. We can't let what other people think tear us apart again." Emily nodded, feeling the emotion rise within her. She gripped his hand tightly, as if holding on to this moment, to the truth they had avoided for so long. Tears finally escaped her eyes, but she didn't care. There was something liberating about finally admitting what she had always known in her heart. Ethan gently pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her in a protective, secure embrace. Emily let herself meld into him, feeling the warmth of his body and the comfort of being there, in the arms of someone who loved her for who she was without expectations, without the burdens her family had placed on her shoulders. For a moment, the world around them disappeared. There were no more responsibilities, no more pressures, no more doubts. It was just her and Ethan, together, as it should have been from the start. The time they had lost seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the silent promise of a future they could build together. This time without hesitation, without running away. They stayed like that for a while, in silence, simply feeling each other's presence. Finally, Emily pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a shy but sincere smile. "I think we're ready to face all of this now," she said, her voice still a little shaky but filled with conviction. Ethan smiled, gently caressing her cheek. "Yes, we are." Emily sat in the living room of the Quinn household. Her gaze fixed on the window where the perfectly manicured garden seemed to reflect the controlled life her family had always wanted for her. The plants were neatly aligned, with not a single leaf out of place, just like the life her parents and her brother Michael had planned for her. Organized, safe, and predictable. She sighed deeply, trying to gather the courage needed for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. Today would be different. She would finally face her family with everything she had held back for so long, and anxiety pulsed through her veins. She rose from the couch when she heard Michael's firm footsteps approaching. She knew he wouldn't come alone. When he appeared at the doorway of the living room, his face already bore a serious expression, as if he knew what was coming. Behind him, her parents appeared, looking surprised to see her there so early. Emily rarely visited without notice, but this was a conversation that could no longer wait. "Emily, what's going on?" Michael was the first to speak, as direct as ever. "I got your message saying you wanted to talk, and from your tone, it sounded urgent." She felt the weight of her parents' and brother's expectations settle over her, as always. For years, living up to what they expected had been her routine. But today, the tension inside her had reached its breaking point. Taking a deep breath, she faced Michael with a determined look. "Yes, it is urgent," she said firmly, keeping her voice steady. "I need all of you to hear what I have to say." Michael crossed his arms, his expression severe, while her parents settled on the couch, their faces filled with concern. A heavy silence hung in the room, as though everyone already had an idea of what was coming but wasn't ready to hear it. Emily looked at her parents, then turned her gaze back to Michael. For a moment, she felt a tightness in her chest, as if she were about to betray something deeply ingrained in her. But that feeling was quickly replaced by the resolve to be true to herself, something she had repressed for far too long. "I'm no longer going to follow the path you've chosen for me," she began, feeling the strength of her words as she spoke them. "I've spent my whole life trying to please you, trying to be the perfect daughter who never disappoints, but I can't do it anymore. I need to live according to what I believe in, with what makes me happy." Michael frowned, his look of surprise quickly turning into irritation. "Emily, what are you talking about? Of course you need to follow the right path. Everything we do is to ensure that you have a stable and secure life." She shook her head, feeling the heat of anger rising in her chest. "But it's not my life that you're ensuring. It's the life you've chosen for me. And I can't do it anymore. I can't keep living up to your expectations, pretending to be someone I'm not. Her mother, who had been silent until now, raised her hand as if to speak, but Emily cut her off. She knew that if she stopped now, she would lose the courage to continue. And what came next was the hardest part. "I love Ethan," she said, the words coming out quickly and directly. "And I won't give him up because of you or what you expect of me. My relationship with him is real, it's true, and I'm tired of pretending it's not." The revelation hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. The shock on her parents' faces and the look of disbelief from Michael confirmed that they had never taken seriously what Emily felt. They had always thought that, in the end, she would follow the plan they had laid out for her, marrying someone appropriate like David, and leaving Ethan behind as a youthful phase that wasn't worth taking seriously. "Emily, this is ridiculous," Michael said, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. "You know this won't work. You and Ethan? He can't give you the life you deserve. He doesn't belong in our world." She felt her blood boil. Those words, that idea that Ethan wasn't good enough, were what had hurt her for years. And she knew, at that moment, she couldn't tolerate it anymore. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "And what do you know about what I deserve, Michael? You're so focused on maintaining this image of perfection, on making sure the Quinn family stays flawless in the eyes of society, that you forgot to ask me what I want. You forgot to ask what makes me happy." She took a step toward him, feeling the intensity of her emotions spill over. "I want Ethan. I want to be with him because he makes me feel alive, because he accepts me as I am, and because he never tried to force me to be something I'm not." Michael looked as though he was about to respond, but Emily didn't give him the chance. She turned to her parents, who looked completely disoriented, as if they were facing a situation they had never imagined. "Mom, Dad, I understand that you've always wanted the best for me, but this control you try to have over my life is suffocating. You need to accept that I'm an adult, and I can make my own choices. I want to build my life with Ethan, and that's not a decision you can make for me." Her mother, with tears welling up in her eyes, finally spoke, her voice hesitant. "But Emily, we just want you to be happy. We want you to have security, stability. Ethan, he can't provide that. We don't want you to suffer." Emily took a deep breath, calming herself before replying. "I understand that you want the best for me, but what you don't see is that what makes me happy, what really gives me security, is being with someone who truly loves me, someone who supports me, who values me. Ethan is that person, and I can't keep ignoring that just to satisfy your expectations." The silence that followed her words was heavy, almost tangible. Michael looked even more irritated, his face tense, while Emily's parents were visibly shaken. The image of the perfect, obedient daughter they had built was crumbling before their eyes. "So, you're willing to risk everything for him?" Michael finally said, his voice low and tense. "You're willing to turn your back on your family, on everything we've worked for a man who can't offer you anything but empty promises?" Emily met his gaze firmly, without hesitation. "Yes, because what he offers me is love, support, and respect. And that means more to me than any status or financial security you could imagine." Michael fell silent, his face hardening. He knew he couldn't convince her anymore. For the first time in years, Emily was standing firm in her decision, and nothing he said would change her mind. Finally, she looked at her parents one last time, her heart heavy but determined. "I hope you can understand this someday. I'm not doing this to rebel against you. I'm doing this because I'm finally choosing what's right for me." With those words, Emily felt a mix of relief and sadness. She knew that confronting her family would create a rift, a distance that might never fully heal. But at the same time, she felt free. For the first time in a long while, she was taking control of her life. And despite the fear and uncertainty, she knew she was making the right choice. She turned and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving her family to process everything she had said. As she walked away from the house, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. And although the road ahead would be full of challenges, Emily knew she was now walking her own path beside Ethan, the man she truly loved. David sat in his office at the hospital, gazing at the breathtaking view of New York before him. The sky was covered with gray clouds, mirroring his mood. He had spent the last few days trying to ignore the feelings of rejection and frustration that consumed him. The truth was staring him in the face, though he had tried to avoid acknowledging it. Emily would never love him the way he wanted. And as hard as it was to accept, he knew that her time with Ethan had sealed their fate. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to focus on the work in front of him, but it was useless. The papers, reports, and charts scattered across his desk made no sense to him at the moment. Since the confrontation with Emily, where she had made her feelings for Ethan clear, David had isolated himself in his own world. Every time he thought about the scene, the way she looked at him, the firmness in her voice when she said she loved Ethan, an overwhelming wave of resentment and hurt hit him. He wanted to believe that, in time, she might change her mind, that perhaps the comfort and stability he offered would be enough to make her reconsider. But the truth, now undeniable, was that it would never happen. He loved Emily, there was no doubt about that. The way he had met her, the time they spent together when they were younger, all of it had built within him the hope that one day they would end up together. To everyone, including their families, they were the perfect pair. Two successful doctors from good families with promising careers and a stable future. It was what the world expected. And for a long time, David thought it was what Emily wanted too. But now he knew that dream was not shared by her. Not really. David stood up and began pacing back and forth in his office, his thoughts racing. He had always been a practical person, someone who made decisions based on logic and reason. But this time, the emotional pain he felt overshadowed any rational analysis. Part of him was furious with Ethan for having won Emily's heart, and even with Emily for not recognizing the value of what he could offer. But more than anything, he was angry with himself for believing he could force a love that didn't exist. He stopped in front of the window, watching the cars below, moving like ants through the busy intersections of Manhattan. His mind was conflicted. He wanted to fight for Emily, to insist, to try to convince her that he was the more sensible choice. Yet, another part of him, the part that understood what it meant to truly love, knew that continuing to insist would be unfair. Not only to her, but to himself as well. He deserved to be loved fully, just as Emily deserved to follow her heart. David couldn't recall the exact moment he started to realize the depth of Emily's feelings for Ethan. Perhaps it was when she mentioned his name, even unconsciously, with a softness in her voice he had never heard before. Or maybe it was in recent times when he noticed the sparkle in her eyes, a glow that appeared whenever she returned from seeing Ethan. The truth was, no matter how hard he tried, he would never be for Emily what Ethan was. And that tore him apart inside. The buzz of a notification on his phone pulled him from his thoughts. It was a message from Michael Quinn, Emily's brother. The tone was cold, practical, as always. "David, we need to talk about the future. I know Emily is acting impulsively, but together we can bring her back to reason." David stared at the message for a moment, feeling a growing irritation. He knew that if he responded, Michael would push him further into a battle for which he no longer had the strength. Michael was convinced he could control his sister's decisions, mold her into what the family wanted. And until recently, David had believed the same. But now, no matter what he said or did, Emily wouldn't change her mind. Without responding, he turned off his phone and set it aside. He felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, as though he were finally accepting something he had avoided for too long. The weight of reality had settled on him. Emily loved Ethan, and that wasn't something he could change, nor did he want it anymore. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he needed to do something he had never done: give up. With a deep sigh, David turned toward his desk, where his passport and documents were neatly arranged. An invitation he had received months earlier, a job offer from a renowned hospital in Seattle, still sat on his desk, nearly forgotten. At the time, he had dismissed the idea of moving, convinced that his life was in New York with Emily. But now, the offer seemed like exactly what he needed. A fresh start, far from the memories, far from everything that reminded him of her. He picked up the invitation and looked at the printed letters. Seattle offered the opportunity to leave everything behind, to start over, without the burden of unmet expectations and a love that would never be his. A part of him resisted this change, the same part that still wished, somehow, Emily would change her mind and come back to him. But another part knew that to move forward, he needed to let go. In the following days, David made the decision to accept the job offer in Seattle. He informed the hospital that he would be relocating soon, packed up his belongings, and began saying goodbye to the life he thought he would have in New York. There was undeniable sadness in each step he took toward his new journey, but at the same time, a sense of freedom began to settle in his heart. As painful as it was to leave Emily behind, he knew it was the best choice for both of them. On the day he decided to say goodbye to Emily, David met her at a small cafe near the hospital. The place was quiet, and the atmosphere contrasted with the turmoil they both felt inside. Emily looked visibly uncomfortable, perhaps already guessing what he was about to say. She knew that things between them had changed forever, and there was a melancholy in her eyes that David couldn't help but notice. "David," Emily began, but he gently interrupted her with a restrained smile. "Emily, you don't need to explain. I've already figured everything out," he said, his voice calm but laden with emotion. "I just wanted to see you one last time before I leave." She frowned, confused. "Leave? What are you talking about?" David took a deep breath, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "I accepted a job offer in Seattle. I'll be moving there in a few weeks." Emily blinked, surprised by the news. There was a mixture of relief and sadness in her expression. She didn't want to hurt David, but she knew the love he hoped for would never materialize. Perhaps, on some level, she knew this was the best outcome for both of them. "David, I didn't know you were planning this." "Neither did I," he admitted, letting out a bitter laugh. "But I guess deep down it's what I needed. A new beginning, you know?" Emily nodded slowly. "I just want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I really hope you find happiness." David looked at her for a long moment, his eyes shining with a mix of emotions. "I know, Emily, and I just want you to be happy too. If Ethan is the one who does that for you, then I won't try to interfere anymore." The silence that followed was filled with mutual acceptance. It was a goodbye, but it didn't carry the bitterness David had expected. Instead, there was a sense of peace slowly settling in. He knew he was making the right choice. "Thank you, David," Emily said sincerely, reaching out to touch his hand affectionately. "For everything." David smiled, giving a slight nod, and held her hand for a brief moment before letting go. "Take care, Emily, and take care of Ethan too." She smiled in return, and at that moment, they both knew they were finally free. The unrequited love had been left behind, and they were both ready to move on with their own lives. The morning in New York seemed ordinary until the moment everything changed. The deafening sound of an explosion echoed through the streets, making the ground tremble beneath the feet of pedestrians. Thick smoke spiraled upwards from one of the city's busiest train stations, quickly spreading panic among onlookers. Sirens blared, and within minutes, news spread throughout the city. A massive explosion had occurred at the central station during peak hours. At the firehouse, Ethan was in the middle of a meeting with his team when the emergency call came in. The gravity of the situation was clear from the first second. The radio crackled with frantic updates, describing chaos and devastation. A bomb, possibly planted on the underground tracks, had detonated, destroying parts of the station and trapping hundreds of people in the trains and tunnels below. Time was critical. Ethan immediately felt the weight of responsibility as his instinct to act kicked in. "Everyone, gear up," he shouted to his team, already rushing to the fire truck. The expressions on his crew's faces were serious, leaving no room for hesitation. They all knew that every second counted, and at that moment, there was no time to think of anything but saving lives. On the way to the station, Ethan remained focused, mentally reviewing the procedures they would follow upon arrival. He had faced countless emergencies before, but each situation was different, and this one felt more terrifying. The updates kept coming over the radio: severe injuries, thick smoke spreading through the tunnels, victims trapped under the debris. He knew the scene would be catastrophic, and they would need every ounce of strength and courage to face what was ahead. Meanwhile, at Bellevue Hospital, Emily was finishing up some paperwork when news of the explosion broke. Her body responded instantly to the urgency. As an experienced trauma doctor, she had dealt with large-scale emergencies before, but the magnitude of this disaster struck deeper. The train station would have been packed with workers and passengers, many of whom were likely critically injured. "Prepare the emergency room for a wave of casualties," Emily commanded, her voice steady as she moved quickly among her fellow doctors. Everyone on the team knew what to do in a crisis like this, but the tension in the air was palpable. She could feel the pressure building inside her, trying to stay calm, but her worry for Ethan was undeniable. She knew he would be in the middle of the chaos, racing against time to rescue those trapped. She couldn't let her fear distract her. Lives were depending on her, and the last thing she could afford now was to lose focus. Emily took a deep breath, mentally organizing her priorities. As the first injured victims began to arrive, the hospital was quickly overwhelmed. Ambulances kept pouring in, unloading bloodied and dazed passengers, and the emergency room descended into chaos. Back at the station, Ethan and his team arrived amidst complete destruction. The station building was partially in ruins, and the entrance to the underground tunnels was blocked by debris. The smell of smoke was suffocating, and the cries of panic and pain from the trapped victims echoed from all directions. Ethan's adrenaline was at its peak, and he knew there was no time to waste. "We need to clear a path to the underground and get as many people out as fast as possible," he ordered his team as they prepared their rescue gear. The heat and smoke made breathing difficult, and visibility was near zero, but Ethan was used to working under pressure. Carefully and with precision, they began to remove the rubble and descend into the tunnels, where dozens of passengers were trapped in partially destroyed train cars. What Ethan found below was worse than he had imagined. Derailed cars, exposed wires, and sparks still crackling on the tracks. The victims were panicked, some trapped between twisted metal, others in shock, unable to react. Ethan and his team moved quickly, stabilizing the severely injured and clearing debris as safely as possible. At the hospital, Emily barely had a moment to breathe. Patients kept arriving, many in critical condition, and the medical team was overwhelmed. Blood and screams filled the emergency room as Emily raced from one stretcher to another, giving orders and providing urgent care. The chaos was complete, but her mind remained sharp, and she followed each step with precision. She couldn't afford any mistakes. As she worked, she couldn't help but think of Ethan constantly. What was he facing at that moment? Was he safe? Every second without news from him heightened her anxiety, but she had to stay focused. The lives before her depended on it. At the station, the situation worsened with each passing minute. Part of the ceiling was about to collapse, and Ethan knew time was running out. He found a group of severely injured passengers in one of the hardest-hit cars, and their condition was critical. With the help of Jake, who had returned to duty after his recovery, they began pulling people out of the cars, one by one, as the heat intensified with every second. "Come on, Jake, one more. We need to get these people out of here now," Ethan shouted, his body tense from the pressure and exhaustion. Even injured, Jake was beside him, fighting with the same determination, showing that his recovery hadn't broken his spirit. Together, they worked tirelessly, removing victims and guiding them out of the tunnel where ambulances were waiting. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the tunnels. Ethan looked up in horror as part of the ceiling began to give way above the car they were evacuating. "Jake, get out of here now," Ethan yelled, pushing his friend out of the way. But before he could escape, the structure partially collapsed, trapping Ethan under a pile of rubble. The impact threw him to the ground with force, and sharp pain shot through his body. His ears rang, and thick dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. He tried to move, but his legs were pinned beneath the debris, and the pain was excruciating. Jake, stunned, turned back and saw Ethan trapped under the rubble. "Ethan!" he shouted, rushing back despite orders to retreat. With bare hands, he began pulling away the debris, desperate to free his friend. At the hospital, Emily was in the middle of another emergency surgery when her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. The buzz sent a shiver through her, something that rarely happened. She never answered her phone during surgery, but something felt different this time. With her heart racing, she asked one of the assistants to check the message. "Emily, it's about Ethan. He's hurt. Trapped at the station," the assistant said, looking at her hesitantly. Emily's world stopped for a moment. The scalpel in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and she felt panic rising in her throat. But there was no room for hesitation. Taking a deep breath, she finished the procedure with her usual precision and passed instructions to the team, her mind racing. As soon as she left the operating room, Emily ran to the floor where the victims of the explosion were being treated. Her thoughts were consumed by Ethan, and the fear of losing him was overwhelming. But she knew that right now, he would be fighting for survival, just as she was fighting to save everyone under her care. At the station, with the help of Jake and other firefighters, Ethan was finally pulled from the rubble, though severely injured. His thoughts drifted between pain and the realization that Liv still needed saving, but his body no longer responded. As he was loaded into the ambulance, he thought of Emily, wishing he could see her one more time, to tell her that despite everything, they had found something real and that he would fight for it just as he fought every day in his job. The ambulance rushed toward Bellevue Hospital, and when it arrived, Emily was already waiting, ready to do whatever it took to save the man she loved. Seeing him being brought in, her heart raced, but she kept her composure. He was alive, and she would do everything in her power to make sure he stayed that way. As the medical team prepared for surgery, Emily held Ethan's hand for a brief moment, whispering softly, "I'm here, Ethan, and I won't lose you." The morning sun poured through the hospital room window, gently illuminating Ethan's face as he lay awake, but still in bed. The physical pain was still present, but now there was a lightness in his heart that he hadn't felt in a long time. The explosion at the train station had been a test, not only for his body, but for his spirit. As he stared out the window, reflecting on the intense days he had lived through, one thought dominated his mind: Emily. He had survived, and she was by his side. She had always been there, even when he hadn't had the courage to admit how he really felt. Now, there was no room left for hesitation. He knew he couldn't live without her, and everything they had been through, all the pain and sacrifice, only reinforced that certainty. The door to the room opened quietly, and he didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. Emily's soft perfume filled the air, and as she approached his bed, Ethan's heart raced. He turned slowly to face her, and their eyes met in a way that spoke more than any words could. This moment was theirs, free from the chaos and doubt that had once consumed them. "How are you feeling?" Emily asked, her voice calm, but laced with the emotions she struggled to keep hidden. She knew Ethan was out of danger, but seeing him lying there, still recovering, touched her deeply. Ethan smiled, a light smile that brightened his face despite the visible exhaustion. "I'm okay, especially now that you're here." She moved closer, pulling a chair next to the bed, and sat down, her hands gently resting on his. Her touch was warm, comforting, and he squeezed her hand softly, feeling the connection between them that had never really broken, despite everything they had faced. I don't know what I would have done if something had happened to you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked down for a moment, avoiding his gaze as she tried to keep her emotions in check. "You risk so much, every day, and I can't help it, Ethan. The fear of losing you is something I carry with me all the time." He squeezed her hand a little tighter, feeling the weight of her words hit him deeply. "I know," he replied softly but firmly, "and you have every right to feel that way. But I'm here, Emily, and I'll keep fighting not just at work but for us, for this love we have." Emily finally looked up, and what she saw in Ethan's eyes was something she had longed to see: unwavering certainty. He was no longer hesitant, no longer hiding his feelings. He was ready to fight for what they had built together, even if it had taken time. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of the moment. They both knew they were at an emotional crossroads, a point where they needed to decide what to do with everything that had happened between them. But this time, there was no fear. There was clarity. Emily stood slightly from her chair and leaned over the bed, their faces just inches apart. "I love you, Ethan," she said, her voice firm but filled with genuine emotion. "And I'm not going to let fear control what I feel anymore. I'm ready to face everything, anything, as long as it's with you." Ethan's heart raced, and he felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him. He knew, in that moment, that everything he had endured, the fear, the pain, the doubts, had been worth it to get to this point. Without saying a word, he raised his hand and gently touched Emily's face, his fingers tracing the soft skin of her cheek. Her eyes closed for a brief moment, savoring the touch, and then she leaned in a little closer. When their lips finally met, it was as if the world around them ceased to exist. The kiss was soft at first, full of tenderness and care, as if they were rediscovering something that had always been there. But as it deepened, it became more intense, filled with urgency and desire. It was a kiss that sealed all the unspoken promises, confirming the love they had always known was there, though so often delayed. Ethan felt the warmth of Emily's body against his, the way her lips moved with his in perfect harmony, as if everything in the universe was exactly where it needed to be at that moment. He pulled her slightly closer, despite the ache in his body, wanting to feel every part of that connection, as if letting go might cause the moment to slip away. Emily, in turn, felt safe in his arms, a security she had sought for so long. There was something in that kiss, in that intimacy, that washed away all the doubts. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew they would both face challenges, both personally and in the demands of their careers. But at that moment, none of that mattered. They were together, and that was enough. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, their eyes sparkled with emotion. Emily smiled, that light smile full of meaning that she rarely showed. Ethan mirrored her smile, a look of relief and love on his face. "We're gonna be okay," he said softly but confidently. "Yes," she nodded slightly. "We are." For a moment, they just stayed there, looking at each other, without the need for more words. They both knew what mattered was what they felt for each other, and that from that moment on, they would face everything as a team, side by side. When Emily finally stepped away to let Ethan rest, he held her hand for a few more seconds, as if wanting to make sure she really wasn't going anywhere. She laughed softly, squeezing his hand one last time before leaving the room. As she walked down the hospital hallway, a feeling of hope and renewal filled her heart. They had overcome the chaos, the pain, and the fear, and now they were ready to build something new, something solid, something real. On the other side of the door, Ethan closed his eyes, a soft smile on his lips. He knew the future would bring its own challenges, but with Emily by his side, he felt ready to face anything. Weeks had passed since the accident, and New York, with its frenetic energy, seemed to be returning to its usual rhythm. The chaos of the explosion and the rush of the hospitals were recent memories, but for Ethan and Emily, it all seemed like a distant past, now something that had shaped them but didn't define them. Autumn was beginning to show signs of its arrival, with the trees in Central Park turning shades of yellow and orange, dancing in the wind. The air was crisp, and the city seemed to breathe with more ease. Ethan and Emily walked hand in hand through the park, enjoying the serenity of the moment. It was one of those rare days when they both had time off together, a small gift amidst their busy routines. Ethan, still with a few bandages on his arms and a faint bruise on the side of his face, looked at peace. The recovery time had been tough for him, a man used to constant action. But now, walking beside Emily with a calm smile, he was grateful for every step. Emily glanced sideways at him, watching the way the wind tousled his hair, how the soft afternoon light highlighted his features, and how their fingers intertwined naturally, comfortably. There was a lightness in the air between them, something new, different. It wasn't the weight of expectations or the tension of uncertain days. It was simply peace. She smiled, remembering how everything had seemed so complicated just weeks ago, when they were both still trapped by fears and doubts. Now, walking beside him, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, there was a sense of belonging she had never imagined possible. "You're quiet," Ethan commented, casting a curious glance at Emily as they continued their walk. "Is everything okay?" She smiled, squeezing his hand lightly. "I'm fine, just thinking about how much has changed so quickly. You know, how just a few weeks ago, I was waiting for you to wake up in that hospital bed, with my heart in my throat. And now we're here, walking like nothing can touch us." Ethan stopped walking for a moment and turned to her, holding both her hands. His eyes, intense and full of affection, met hers. "Nothing can touch us, Emily," he said with quiet conviction. "We've been through so much, and look where we are now. Together. No matter what comes, we'll face it. As a team." Emily smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. Ethan always knew how to calm her insecurities, and this time was no different. He was there, whole, present, and ready to walk beside her down any path they chose. She took a step forward and rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of Ethan's heartbeat against her face, a beat that reassured her. "And you? How are you feeling?" she asked, looking up at him. "I know physically you're getting better, but mentally, how are you after everything that happened?" Ethan was silent for a moment, reflecting on Emily's words. He had gone through a near-death experience that had marked him deeply, and although he was used to danger, the incident at the station had forced him to confront his own mortality more directly than ever before. But he knew that, despite everything, the real change in his life wasn't just about the accident, it was about what he had gained after surviving. The clarity that he didn't want to delay anything anymore, especially when it came to Emily. "I'm okay," he finally replied with a soft smile. "I spent a lot of days thinking about what could have happened, about how lucky I was to get out alive. But, every time I think about it, the only thing I can really focus on is that in the end, I woke up and you were there. And that gave me a new perspective. It made me see that what matters isn't what could have been, but what we have now." She lifted her head, and their eyes met again. "I was so scared," Emily confessed. "The thought of losing you. It made me realize that I had been holding back for so long, hiding behind fear, behind expectations, and it almost cost me what matters most." "You." Ethan smiled, pulling her closer and placing a hand on her face, his thumb gently stroking the soft skin of her cheek. "And now?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Now that you're not holding back?" Emily laughed softly, feeling the freedom in her response. "Now, I just want to live this. Live us. No fears, no hesitations." The two stood in silence for a moment, simply absorbing each other's presence. Around them, the park felt like a living painting, with children running, people walking their dogs, and the soft sound of leaves rustling in the wind. The city continued its bustling life. But there, in that instant, Ethan and Emily were in a world of their own, where everything made sense. They resumed their walk hand in hand, their fingers intertwined like a silent promise. Emily felt the warmth of Ethan's hand as an anchor grounding her in the present, while he, in turn, felt the lightness of her presence as a constant relief, a reminder that no matter how difficult things might get, they would always have each other. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Ethan stopped again, this time gently pulling Emily toward a small grassy hill where they could see the horizon. They sat together, still holding hands, watching the natural spectacle unfold before them. "This is our future," Ethan said quietly as he looked at the sunset. "Full of uncertainties, sure, but also full of moments like this, where we can just be." Emily rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body next to hers, and smiled. "And that's all I need." They stayed there, in silence, watching as the sun slowly disappeared, knowing that what they had, despite all the difficulties, was real. And for the first time in a long while, they were both ready to face whatever came their way together.